Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I'd been flying small aircraft for over a decade, mostly charter flights and the occasional sightseeing trip. That afternoon was routine, a short hop from Billings to a private strip just outside of Sheridan. It was cold, clear air with a thin layer of high clouds. I remember thinking the light had that washed-out silvery look you get in winter when the sun can't quite burn through. I was about 30 minutes from landing when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a break in the clouds catching the sun in an odd way. But it moved, fast. A metallic disc dropped straight down from the cloud layer, perfectly vertical, no tilt, no wobble. It stopped midair, hung there for maybe 2 seconds, then shot off horizontally and vanished into the haze over the mountains. No sound, no contrail, nothing. I didn't even have time to react before it was gone. My first thought was that I'd just seen another plane from a weird angle, but there were no wings. It was too smooth, too clean. I kept glancing at my instruments, half expecting something to go haywire, but everything stayed normal. I landed without incident and taxied toward the hangar. That's when I noticed them. 2 men standing just inside the shadow of the building. Both wore black suits, white shirts, plain dark ties. No coats, even though it was barely 25 degrees out. One was tall and thin, the other shorter, broader in the shoulders. Both were pale, like they hadn't seen sunlight in months. They didn't approach me at first. They just stood there as I shut down the engine and climbed out. Then the taller one stepped forward and said, "Mr. Harlan?" in a flat, almost mechanical voice. I nodded, still trying to place how they knew my name. "We'd like a moment of your time," the shorter one said. He held a clipboard with a few sheets of paper clipped to it. "We understand you observed an aerial anomaly on your approach." I froze. I hadn't called anyone about it. I hadn't even decided what to call it myself. "I saw something," I said. "Not sure what." "That's why we're here," the taller one replied. "This is standard procedure for atmospheric interference reports in controlled airspace." He handed me a pen, flipping the clipboard toward me. The paper was some kind of form with small, dense text. The only words I caught on the first glance were atmospheric interference and no threat to flight safety. They wanted me to sign at the bottom, confirming that whatever I'd seen had been a known atmospheric effect. No mention of aircraft, no mention of unidentified anything. I didn't sign right away. "Who are you with?" I asked. "Federal jurisdiction," the shorter man said, as if that explained everything. "Which agency?" He just repeated, "Federal jurisdiction." The wind was picking up, and I could hear the hangar doors rattling behind them. I realized no one else was around. The guy who usually handled my arrivals wasn't there, and the fuel truck was parked with no driver in sight. The whole airstrip felt empty. "Look," I said, "I don't feel comfortable signing something when I don't even." "You did see atmospheric interference," the taller one cut in. It wasn't a question. His voice didn't get louder, and the sight, but it carried this strange weight, like I was already supposed to agree. "I saw a metallic object," I said slowly. "Not." The shorter man stepped closer, so close I could see tiny flecks in his irises, though they didn't look quite right. Too uniform in color, almost gray. "The object you saw was not metallic," he said, as if correcting me. "It was atmospheric interference." I glanced toward the small terminal building, thinking maybe someone would walk out, but the windows were dark. It occurred to me then that I hadn't heard a single other engine or voice since landing. The taller man extended the clipboard again. "Please sign, Mr. Harlan. We have other matters to attend to." Something in me just wanted to get out of there. I signed my name without reading the rest of the form. The shorter man pulled the paper away the moment my pen left the page, tucking it under his arm. They both stepped back in unison, as if the conversation was over. No handshake, no thank you. Just a slight nod from the taller one before they turned and walked into the shadowed part of the hangar. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether to follow them, but when I stepped inside, the hangar was empty. No open doors on the far side, nowhere they could have gone without me seeing. The sound of another plane starting up somewhere down the strip broke the silence, and suddenly the place felt normal again. My usual ground crew guy appeared from around the corner asking if I needed fuel. When I asked if he'd seen the two men who'd just been here, he looked at me blankly and said no one had been around all day. I didn't push it. I just paid for my fuel and left. But when I checked my cockpit later, I noticed my flight log, where I jot down quick notes after landing, was gone. The pen I kept clipped to the side was still there, but the notepad wasn't. I never saw those men again. It was about 10 at night, maybe a little later. I'd stepped out on the porch with a cup of tea before bed, something I do most nights just to unwind. We live on the edge of town, so it's quiet out here, and on clear nights you can see every star in the sky. That night was especially clear. Cold too, the kind of crisp air that makes sound carry. I was leaning on the railing, looking up, when I noticed one star that didn't seem right. At first, I thought it was just a plane, except it wasn't moving steadily. It would drift a little, stop, then jerk to the side. It wasn't fast, exactly, just deliberate. I kept my eyes on it for a good minute, and that's when it did something that made my stomach tighten. It moved in a perfect arc around another star, and then stopped dead again, like it was checking its position. I actually laughed under my breath, thinking maybe I was just tired. But then it started getting brighter, just a little, like it was coming closer. It wasn't a beam or a flash, more like the glow itself was intensifying. I turned my head for a second to put my mug down, and when I looked back, it was gone. Not faded. Gone. The next morning, I had an early shift at the cafe. It's one of those small town places where everyone knows each other and you don't get many strangers unless they're passing through on the highway. I opened up at 6 and was still the only one on the floor around 8, wiping down tables between the few locals who came in. The bell over the door rang and two men walked in, both wearing black suits. Not just dark, but the kind of sharp, perfectly pressed black you'd expect at a funeral. They both had black hats too, like old-fashioned fedoras. No coats, even though it was freezing out. They didn't head to the counter. They walked straight to the booth directly behind the one I was cleaning and sat down. Neither of them took their hats off. Neither of them looked at me. I asked if they wanted menus, but they just sat there. One of them gave the smallest shake of his head, but didn't say a word. I figured maybe they were waiting for someone, so I left them alone and went behind the counter to top off the coffee pot. But after a couple minutes, I realized something weird. They weren't talking to each other, at all. They were just sitting facing forward, perfectly still. Every time I moved around the cafe, I could feel, more than see, that one of them would turn his head slightly, like he was tracking where I was. Not obvious enough that I could call it staring, but enough to keep my skin crawling. A few locals came and went. A couple of them glanced toward the booth and then looked away quick, like they didn't want to get involved. Around 9, my friend and coworker Chelsea came in to take over the morning shift. She gave me this little look like, "What's up with them?" And I just shrugged. I hung around for a few minutes to grab a coffee for the road before heading out, and that's when something happened that still gets under my skin. As I was pouring my coffee, the one sitting on the inside of the booth leaned slightly toward the other, not like he was whispering, but like he was listening. The other one moved his lips just barely, like he was speaking without sound. I could hear the hum of the cooler, the faint clink of dishes in the back, but nothing from them. And yet, I had this feeling, like pressure in my ears, almost like when you're too close to a subwoofer. I turned toward the counter to put the lid on my coffee, and when I glanced back, they were both staring straight at me. Not blinking, not frowning, just watching. I left without saying anything. When I stepped outside, their black SUV was parked right out front. I hadn't even heard it pull up earlier. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I walked to my truck, trying not to look at it, but as soon as I opened my door, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Both men were now standing just inside the cafe doorway, still in perfect sync, both looking right at me. I started the truck and pulled out, watching in my rearview mirror as they stepped out onto the sidewalk, side by side. They didn't follow me, not right away. But when I got to the first stop sign, I glanced in the mirror again, and the SUV was rolling out of the lot. They stayed a couple cars back, never speeding, never getting too close. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence, but they followed me all the way to the edge of town. When I turned onto the county road, they went straight. That night, I went out on the porch again, half expecting to see that star moving around like before. The sky was clear, the same as the night before, but that spot where I'd first seen it was empty. For weeks after, I kept thinking I saw the SUV parked on side streets or in the grocery store lot, but it was always far enough away that I couldn't be sure. They never came back into the cafe. But sometimes when I'm outside late, I get the same tight feeling in my ears, like that low-pressure hum is just under the quiet. It was early October, about a week after the summer crowds had died down. I was on night shift at Clear Falls State Park, which mostly meant checking that the gates were locked, patrolling the campground once or twice, and sitting in the truck with the radio on low. Nights were quiet that time of year, too quiet sometimes. Around 9:40 p.m., the ranger station phone rang. It was a guy named Darren who ran the bait shop in town. He said he'd just had two different fishermen come in, both rattled, both saying they'd seen strange lights over the lake about half an hour earlier. One claimed it looked like a lantern drifting under the water but moving too fast, and the other said it was more like a spotlight shining straight up from below. Darren figured it might be poachers or somebody messing around, so he thought I should know. I signed out the keys for the truck, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out. The lake was about a 10-minute drive from the station. It was a calm night, just a slight breeze, and the moon was barely a sliver. The air smelled like wet leaves. When I got near the turnoff to the North Shore lot, I noticed a car parked just inside the access road. Black sedan, no plates that I could see. It was angled so the headlights pointed toward the trees, not the road. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a visitor who got lost. Then I saw two men standing on the path that led down to the water. They were facing the lake, still as fence posts. Both wore dark suits, not jackets you'd wear hiking, but pressed, tailored suits, and wide-brimmed hats that made it hard to see their faces. They weren't holding fishing rods, cameras, nothing. Just standing there. I pulled up and got out, figuring I'd walk down and see what was going on. My boots crunched on the gravel, and they both turned to look at me at the exact same time. Their movements were in sync, like they'd rehearsed it. One of them stepped forward and said, "You'll need to return to the station." His voice was deep but completely flat. There was no inflection at all. I told him I was the on-duty ranger and that I was responding to reports of lights on the lake. "This location is under federal jurisdiction tonight," he said, same tone. "You may return to the station." I asked if they could identify themselves. The second man reached into his coat and showed me something. Looked like an ID wallet, but it was so quick and angled that I couldn't read it. I caught a flash of a seal, maybe an eagle, but it was gone before I could be sure. I said, "We don't usually have federal officers here without notice," and the first man replied, "Notice has been given." I asked to who, and he just stared at me. Not angrily, not impatiently, just stared like he was waiting for me to stop talking. The silence stretched until I could hear the wind moving the branches overhead. Something about their presence felt wrong, not in a threatening way exactly, but in the way you realize you've walked into the wrong room and everyone there knows it but you. Finally, I said, "All right, I'll call this in." "You will not," the first man said immediately. Same flat voice. "Return to the station." I felt my stomach tighten. I glanced toward the water and noticed faint light rippling across the surface about 100 yards out like a reflection. But there was no source. It wasn't the moon, and it wasn't a boat. It looked like it was coming from beneath. When I looked back, both men were watching me. Not just looking, watching, like they were waiting to see what I'd do next. I don't know why, but I got the sudden urge to just leave. Not because I was scared they'd hurt me, but because I didn't want to stand there with them any longer. It felt like I wasn't supposed to see whatever was happening. I nodded, said, "All right," and walked back to the truck. I half expected them to follow, but they didn't move. When I drove out, the black sedan was still parked where I'd seen it, engine off, no lights. I went back to the station, sat at my desk, and stared at the phone for a long time. I didn't call anyone, not my supervisor, not the sheriff's office. I just sat there. Around midnight, I decided to swing back toward the lake, figuring maybe they'd be gone by then. When I got there, the sedan was gone, and the shoreline was empty. No light on the water, no footprints on the gravel. The air felt colder than it had earlier, but that could have just been the temperature drop. The next morning, I asked a couple of the other rangers if anyone had gotten word about federal officers visiting the park. Nobody had. I checked the incident logs. Nothing. Later that afternoon, I stopped by Darren's bait shop. I asked if he'd heard any more about those lights. He gave me a look like I'd said something strange and told me he didn't know what I was talking about. I reminded him about the call he made to me the night before, but he just shook his head and said, I must have been thinking of someone else. I didn't push it. That night, when I drove past the lake on my way home, I slowed down at the North Shore turnoff. It was empty. No sedan, no figures, nothing but dark trees and the sound of crickets. But I kept driving without stopping. It was late February, one of those gray weeks where the sun never seems to show up, and I'd been pulling long nights in the meteorology lab at school. I'm a senior majoring in atmospheric science, and my advisor had given me permission to use some archive satellite imagery for my thesis. Most of it was boring. Jet streams, cloud formations, the occasional hurricane spiraling out in the Pacific. But I liked the work. The lab was quiet after dark, and I could get into a rhythm without anyone bothering me. One Tuesday night, I was going through some infrared images from a NOAA satellite feed. They were time-stamped and geotagged like usual. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something odd. There was a series of frames over the Midwest that showed a perfect circular heat signature in the middle of otherwise normal cloud cover. It wasn't huge, maybe a couple miles across, but it stood out. The thing was, it didn't move with the clouds. Frame after frame, it just hovered there, and then between two captures, maybe 30 seconds apart, it was gone. No dispersal, no drift. Just vanished. I flagged the files and kept going. The next set was from a week earlier, different region entirely, somewhere over the coast of Maine. Same thing. Perfect circle, completely stationary, gone in under a minute. I started thinking maybe it was an artifact or a glitch in the satellite's imaging system, but then I found a third, this time over southern Nevada, dated only 3 days prior. By then, I was leaning in close to the monitor, rewinding the timestamps, flipping between the thermal and visible light layers. In visible light, there was nothing, just normal cloud cover. In thermal, there it was, clear as day. I didn't tell anyone right away. I wanted to cross-check, see if maybe one of the physics students or the remote sensing guys had seen similar data artifacts. I started pulling from more sources, European satellites, even some old MODIS data. Over the next few nights, I found 7 more examples going back 2 years. All perfectly round, all motionless, all gone in less than a minute. Thursday night, I decided to start a proper log. I was screen grabbing the images, noting coordinates and times, and saving them to a folder on my desktop. By 3 a.m., I had nearly 30 examples. It felt strange, like I'd stumbled onto something no one had bothered to look for. I went home, slept a few hours, then came back mid-afternoon. When I logged into the lab computer, there was a sticky note on the monitor with my name on it in block letters. See me, Dr. Larkin. That was my advisor. I went to his office and he was on the phone. He covered the receiver and said, "We need to talk. After this." His tone wasn't angry exactly, but it was short, clipped. I said okay and went back to the lab. 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hallway. 2 pairs, heavy, deliberate. I looked up and there were 2 men standing in the doorway. Both wore black suits. Not cheap ones either. Pressed, fitted, white shirts, black ties. Their shoes looked like they'd been polished 5 minutes earlier. One was tall, maybe 6'4", pale with sharp features. The other was shorter, broader, darker skin. Neither of them looked like they belonged in a university building. The tall one said my name like it was a question. I nodded. He said, "We'll need to see your workstation." His voice was flat, almost mechanical. No introduction, no ID. I froze for a second, then pointed to my desk. They didn't ask permission, they just walked in. The shorter one sat down at my terminal, typed something fast, and the screen lit up. He navigated straight to the folder where I'd been saving the images. I don't know how he knew where it was. He didn't search, didn't click through anything. He opened the first file, looked at it for maybe half a second, then dragged it to the recycle bin. Did the same for the next. And the next. I started to say, "Hey, wait," but the tall one cut me off without even looking at me. These are not for your use. It wasn't a threat exactly, but it didn't feel like a request either. Within a minute, every single file was gone. The shorter one emptied the recycle bin, then opened the system log and cleared it. He did the same for the cloud backup. My backups weren't even logged into under my account anymore. They'd already signed in under something else. When he was done, he stood up, and they both looked at me. The tall one said, "You will not attempt to recover these. Do you understand?" I didn't answer at first. My mouth was dry. He repeated the question. I just nodded. Without another word, they walked out. I followed them to the hallway, but they didn't head toward the main exit. They turned down the side corridor that leads to the old geology wing, which has been under renovation for months. I hesitated, then stepped after them, but by the time I rounded the corner, they were gone. No sound of doors opening or closing. I went back to my desk and tried to think. I still had my USB drive in my bag, but when I checked it, the files were gone from there too. Every backup, even the notes I'd typed up in a separate document, gone, deleted clean, like they'd never been there. Dr. Larkin finally came by about 20 minutes later. He didn't mention the sticky note or the men, just said, "I'm assigning you a new data set for your thesis. Focus on that, please." Then he walked away before I could respond. That night, I stayed in the lab past midnight again. I kept the lights low and only worked on the new data set. Around 1 a.m., I went to the vending machine down the hall. When I came back, there was a folded piece of paper sitting on my keyboard. I hadn't heard anyone come in. It just said, "Stop." I looked out into the hallway. Empty. The building was silent, except for the hum of the air vents. I packed up and left without finishing my work. For the rest of the semester, I didn't see them again. I stopped pulling those satellite frames, stopped talking about what I'd found. But every now and then, when I walked across campus late at night, I'd see a black sedan parked on the street near the science building. Engine off. No one inside that I could see. I never checked too closely. It was mid-November, one of those clear, cold mornings where the frost hangs in the air, even after the sun's been up for an hour. I was out near the old logging road past Dry Creek, carrying my rifle, but mostly just walking. Hunting was almost an excuse to get out there by myself. That part of the forest is usually dead quiet, except for the occasional crow, and I'd gone far enough that the snowmobile tracks had thinned out to nothing. I cut off the main path toward a spot I'd found the year before, a little clearing about 100 yards wide, ringed with tall spruce. It's the kind of place you only know about if you've been wandering out there a while. My boots crunched through the frost, and I was looking for fresh deer sign when I noticed something strange about the light in the clearing. At first, I thought I was seeing heat shimmer, but it was cold enough to see my breath. Then I realized the air above the center of the clearing was bent somehow, like the way water distorts the bottom of a river. That's when I saw it. Hanging about 20 feet up was something shaped almost like a stretched out oval, but the surface looked wrong, like liquid metal, perfectly mirroring the trees around it. It blended so well with the background that if it hadn't been moving slightly, I probably would have missed it. It wasn't spinning or swaying. It was just hovering there. I stood still for a long time, just listening. Nothing. No wind in the branches, no birds, not even the distant hum of highway noise you usually get if the air's still. Just dead silence. I don't know how long I watched it. Maybe a minute, maybe 5, but it never made a sound. Not even the faint buzzing you'd expect from a drone. Then, as I shifted my weight, it rippled. The whole surface pulsed like someone had dropped a pebble into a pond, and it seemed to tilt slightly toward me. That's when my stomach dropped. I can't explain it, but it felt like it noticed me. I backed toward the tree line, keeping my eyes on it. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. I figured I'd circle back to the logging road and head straight for my truck. About halfway back, the forest started to feel different. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy, like the air had thickened. I kept my rifle in my hands, finger just outside the trigger guard. When I rounded a bend in the trail, they were just there. Two men standing side by side in the middle of the path, both wearing black suits, long coats, and hats that looked out of place in the woods. Their clothes were spotless, not a speck of frost or dirt, even though the trail was muddy in spots. Neither of them looked at my rifle. They didn't even look at my face, exactly. More like they were looking through me. One of them stepped forward just enough that I noticed his shoes were polished black leather. Perfectly clean. "You've gone off limits," he said. His voice was flat, no accent I could place, but it had this strange rhythm to it, like each word was measured out. I didn't know what to say. My mouth went dry. I glanced past them, wondering if I could push through the trees and skirt around, but something about the way they stood made me stop. The second one spoke. "Turn around. Use another route." Same flat tone. I tried to play dumb, said I was just out for deer, and didn't know there were any boundaries out here. Neither reacted. They didn't even blink. When I didn't move right away, they both took a step forward in unison. Not threatening exactly, but precise, like they'd rehearsed it. That was enough for me. I muttered, "All right," and backed up a few steps before turning. I didn't run, but I walked fast, taking the long way around through thicker trees until I found the main road again. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but there was nothing. When I finally got back to my truck, there was a thin layer of frost on the windshield, even though it had been clear when I left it that morning. My phone, which I'd been using to check the time earlier, was off, completely dead. I figured the cold had drained it, but when I plugged it in at home later, it powered on like normal, still at 62% battery. I thought about going back the next day to see if the clearing looked different, but when I checked the weather report, they were calling for heavy snow in that area for the rest of the week. I never did go back. And I don't hunt alone anymore. It was just after 2 in the morning when I noticed it on the cameras. I was working the night shift at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town. The place is huge, 15 loading bays, a small office block attached, and about 3 acres of fenced-in lot. My job was basically to watch monitors, log truck arrivals, and do the occasional walk-around. Most nights were dead quiet. That night, the weather was clear and cold. The wind had been kicking up now and then, but nothing that set off the motion sensors. I was halfway through a cup of stale coffee when I glanced at the screen for camera 12. It covers the far corner of the southern yard. No lights out there except the dim perimeter ones. At first, I thought the image was glitching, but then I leaned closer. There was a shape, not a truck, not anything I recognized, sitting low behind the far fence line, near the trees. It wasn't throwing shadows like it should have. The thing was glowing faintly, not like a spotlight or a headlight, but this soft whitish light that seemed to pulse. I squinted at it, thinking maybe a neighbor had a weird lamp or something had reflected off the lens, but no. It was there, solid, and it wasn't moving. I checked the other cameras. It didn't show up on 13 or 14, which made sense since those angles were blocked by storage containers. But camera 12 had it dead on. My first thought was to grab my phone and take a picture of the monitor, but I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to move. I kept watching for maybe 30 seconds, and then the glow shifted, like it tilted or rotated, but there was no sound. None. Even from that distance, if it had been a truck or machinery, I should have heard something. Then, in less time than it took to blink, the thing just wasn't there anymore. No fade out. No movement. Gone. I was still staring at the empty yard when the front gate camera popped up on the motion feed. A dark van, no logos, no plates I could read, pulled up outside the security office. That was already strange. We don't get unannounced visitors, especially not in unmarked vans at 2 in the morning. 2 men got out. Both wore black suits. Not navy, not charcoal. Black. White shirts, black ties. They didn't look like truck drivers or inspectors. The taller one had a narrow face and skin so pale it looked almost gray under the security lights. The shorter one kept his head lowered like he was studying the ground. Neither of them smiled. I buzzed the intercom. "Can I help you?" The taller one looked directly at the camera and said, in this flat, even voice, "We need access to the southern loading bay." That stopped me cold. The southern loading bay isn't on any public map. It's an older section that hasn't been used in years, tucked behind the newer expansions. We keep it locked up, no deliveries scheduled. As far as I knew, only management and security knew it was even called that. I didn't answer right away. He repeated it exactly the same. "We need access to the southern loading bay." I asked who they were with. The shorter man glanced at the taller one, then just said, "Time-sensitive matter." Every instinct told me not to let them in. But they didn't look like guys you could argue with. They just stood there, waiting. No shifting their weight, no looking around, just still. I told them I'd have to call my supervisor. The taller one said, "We've already spoken to him," which I knew wasn't true. The supervisor on call was a guy named Dennis who lived 2 towns over, and he would have told me if anyone was coming. Before I could push it further, the shorter man stepped closer to the glass of the security door. His eyes, I swear, didn't reflect the light. I've seen enough people come through here to know what eyes look like under those lights. His were just flat, dark. I finally said I couldn't let them in without clearance and reached for the phone. When I looked up again, they were walking back to the van. No arguing, no threats. Just turning away like it was nothing. The van pulled off without headlights, rolling smooth down the access road until it was swallowed by the dark. I switched to the road cameras, but they never showed up on any of them, and that road only has 2 turns before you hit the main highway. I went back to camera 12. The yard was empty, still and dark. For the rest of my shift, every creak of the building made me flinch. No more vans showed up, no more strange shapes behind the fence. When Dennis came in at 6 to relieve me, I told him about the men. He just looked at me like I was messing with him. Said nobody called him, and no visitors were logged. We checked the gate camera feed. The recording for that time slot was just gone. Corrupted file, the system said. Every other camera was fine, except for camera 12. That one was black for about 4 minutes right after I first saw the glow. I stayed quiet after that. Didn't mention the details to anyone else. But sometimes, when I'm out in the lot at night, I catch myself glancing toward that far corner, half expecting to see that pale light again, pulsing in the dark. It was late afternoon, early winter, cold enough that my breath came out in big white clouds. I was about 20 feet up in the bucket, replacing a cracked insulator on a rural line. The job site was about 6 miles outside of town, just fields and a thin dirt road. No houses close by, no traffic except the occasional farm truck. I had the harness on and the tools clipped to my belt, just going through the motions. My partner Dale was back in the truck doing paperwork. I remember hearing him flipping through the inspection logs while I worked. It was quiet, except for the wind in the wires. I noticed it because it didn't sound like the wind anymore. There was this low hum. Not loud, but steady, like a refrigerator running in the next room, except there was nothing out there that could make that noise. I turned and saw it over the fields to the east. It wasn't high up, maybe a couple 100 feet, but it just hung there, perfectly still, oval shape, dark against the pale sky with a shimmer around it like the air over asphalt in the summer. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it wasn't a plane or a helicopter. No blades, no wings, no sound of engines, just that hum like it was vibrating the air. I reached for the radio on my harness. The second my thumb pressed the button, the hum cut off. Dead silence. The thing tilted slightly and started moving, slow at first, then shot straight up until it disappeared into the cloud cover. I must have been staring at that empty patch of sky for a good 10 seconds when I heard tires crunching on gravel. A black SUV rolled to a stop right beneath my lift. Big, shiny, no plates on the front. 2 men got out, both in black suits, white shirts, black ties. Same height, same build, like they could have been brothers. The first one shaded his eyes and waved for me to come down. I hesitated. We were on a public road, but I wasn't expecting company, and they didn't look like the sort of guys who check power lines. No hard hats, no logos. The second one spoke, voice flat and even. "Sir, we need you to come down." Something about the way he said it wasn't a request. I lowered the bucket slowly, and the first man stepped forward as soon as I touched the ground. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Up close, his skin was pale, almost gray, and his features were, I don't know how to put it, too smooth, like his face didn't have normal lines or texture. "Everything working all right up there?" he asked. I nodded. "Just fixing an insulator." "You didn't happen to notice anything unusual?" I didn't answer right away. Dale was still in the cab of the truck, watching. I glanced at him, and the second man stepped slightly to block my view. The first man's voice stayed calm, but it had an edge now. "If you saw something in the sky, it's important you tell us, for your own safety." I said I didn't know what they were talking about. The second man looked past me, up at the lines, then back down. "We're going to ask you not to discuss this with anyone. It would be best for everyone involved." That's when I noticed neither of them had coats. It was 30 degrees out, wind cutting across the fields, and they were just standing there in thin suits like the cold didn't touch them. Before I could think of what to say, the first man stepped back toward the SUV. "We appreciate your cooperation," he said, like the conversation was already over. They both got in and drove off, no dust from the tires, just smooth and slow until they were out of sight. I looked up at Dale, but he didn't come down from the truck. When I climbed in, I asked him what the hell that was about. He said, "What guys?" I thought he was joking, but he swore up and down he hadn't seen anyone. Said he heard a vehicle pull up, but when he looked out, the road was empty. We finished the job in silence. The whole drive back, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that SUV behind us. That night, I thought about calling someone, my boss, maybe even the sheriff, but I didn't know what I'd even say. Two weird guys told me not to talk about something I didn't see. Still, every time I close my eyes, I can picture that dark shape hanging over the fields. And I keep hearing that hum. We were coming back from dinner at my sister's place, out past the edge of town. It was one of those clear, cold nights where the stars actually look sharp, and the moon was bright enough to throw shadows across the road. Julie was driving, and I had the window cracked because I liked the smell of the air out there. We'd just come off Route 19, maybe 10 minutes from our place, when something passed across the moon. I don't mean clouds. There weren't any. This was solid, perfectly circular, or close enough that my brain read it that way. It moved slow enough that I actually saw it block the light, then the moonlight came back and it was gone. Julie saw it too. She didn't say anything at first, but I could tell from the way her hands tightened on the wheel. "Did you?" I started, and she just nodded, still looking straight ahead. We didn't talk much after that. The road felt emptier than usual, even though it's never really busy out there at night. By the time we hit the turnoff for our street, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a plane catching the light weird or a bird closer than I thought. When we pulled into the driveway, that's when I saw him. There was a black car, looked like one of those older Lincolns, shiny but not new, parked just outside the entrance to our drive. A man was leaning against it. Black suit, black tie, white shirt. No coat, even though you could see his breath in the air. He wasn't looking at us when we first saw him, just kind of staring toward the tree line across the street. Julie slowed almost to a stop at the bottom of the driveway. That's when he turned his head toward us. His movements were slow and exact, like someone in a movie hitting a mark. I could see his face now, pale, thin, no facial hair, no glasses. His eyes seemed dark, not just in color, dark like there was nothing catching the light in them. When Julie rolled the car forward, he stepped toward her side of the window, not fast, but like he already knew we weren't going to drive away. "You enjoy the show tonight?" he asked. His voice was low, even, and didn't match his expression, which was nothing at all. Neither of us answered right away. I think Julie thought he might be talking about something else, like fireworks or some local thing we didn't know about, but he just kept looking at her, waiting. "What show?" she finally asked. His mouth twitched into something that could have been a smile, but only for a second. "The one you just saw." He said it like he was correcting her, like she'd already admitted something. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but my throat went dry. Julie didn't say anything either, just put the car in park. That's when I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not crickets, not wind, nothing. It wasn't dead silent exactly, more like every other sound had been pushed way into the background. The man looked at me then for the first time. His gaze didn't move between us, just locked onto me and stayed there. "Do you have any questions?" he said. I shook my head without meaning to. "Good," he said, and stepped back from the car. He didn't turn around when he walked back to the black Lincoln, just moved backwards, still facing us back, until he was right up against the driver's side door. Then he slid in without looking down, like he knew exactly where it was. Julie pulled up the driveway fast. When we got to the garage, she didn't get out right away. We just sat there for a minute, both of us looking in the mirrors. The street was empty. The next morning, I went out early to get the paper. There were 2 sets of tire tracks on the shoulder where that car had been parked, but no footprints in the frost, not even ours from the night before. I was driving back from my cousin Matt's place in Belford, taking County Road 16 instead of the main highway. It was late, maybe just after 11, and I like that road at night because it's quiet. No streetlights, just a long stretch of dark with the occasional mailbox. It was cold but clear, and I had the heat on low with the window cracked. The air smelled like wood smoke from someone's stove. I wasn't even thinking about much, just the music playing softly and the fact that I'd have to be up early the next morning. I'd gone maybe 8 or 9 miles past town when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, in a field to the left, a perfectly straight column of white light shot up from the ground into the sky. It wasn't like a searchlight or a flashlight beam. It didn't spread out or flicker. It was narrow, solid-looking almost, and brighter than anything I've ever seen. I slowed without realizing it, staring at it through the driver's side window. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then snapped off, leaving nothing but darkness. No afterglow, no smoke, no sound. I pulled over just past a gravel driveway and turned off my headlights for a moment, half expecting it to come back. The field was just black now, maybe with a faint outline of the tree line in the distance. I sat there for a minute, trying to decide if I should pull into the driveway and get a better look. That part of the county is just farmland and old barns. No one's out there this time of night. But something about it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't see. I kept going. My speed was slower now, maybe 35, and I kept checking the mirrors. The road was still empty behind me. About 5 minutes later, I came over a small rise and saw a set of taillights ahead. They were low and wide apart, like an older car. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It was parked sideways across both lanes. It was a black sedan. No markings, no lights on except the dim glow of the brake lights. I slowed way down, maybe to 10 miles an hour, and rolled forward until I was about 30 feet away. 2 men were standing in front of it, one near each headlight. Both were in dark suits, white shirts, no ties. They weren't looking at each other or talking. They were both looking straight at me. The one on the left raised his arm slowly and made a sort of turn around motion with his hand. It wasn't frantic, just deliberate. The other man didn't move. I rolled down my window halfway. "Is everything all right?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the cold air. Neither of them answered. The one with his arm raised just kept making the same motion. I thought maybe there'd been an accident ahead or the road was blocked by a fallen tree, but there were no flashing lights, no debris, nothing. I sat there another few seconds, my hand resting on the gear shift. Something about the way they stood there, still, symmetrical, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It didn't feel like a normal traffic stop or a warning. It felt staged. Finally, I put the car in reverse and backed up slowly until I could turn into a side road I'd passed 100 feet back. In the mirror, I saw them still standing there, same positions, not moving. The side road looped around through more farmland and eventually reconnected with County Road 16 about 4 miles further on. When I got back to the main road, I drove toward where they'd been. There was nothing there. No car, no people. Just empty pavement under my headlights. I kept driving, faster now, all the way until the county line where I finally saw another car heading the opposite direction. My hands were stiff on the wheel. When I got home, I sat in the driveway for a long time with the engine running, trying to decide if I should call someone. I didn't even know who I'd report it to. What would I say? That I saw a beam of light in a field, and then two silent men in suits blocked the road? The next day, I drove the same stretch of County Road 16 in the daylight. The field where I'd seen the light was just bare dirt and weeds. No tracks, no equipment, no sign anything had been there. At the spot where the sedan had blocked the road, there were no skid marks or tire tracks leading into the ditch. It was like they'd never been there at all. That night, when I took the trash out, I noticed a car parked at the far end of the street. Black sedan, older model, no front plate. The windows were too tinted to see inside. When I came back out 10 minutes later, it was gone. I was hiking alone that evening, taking the fire road that loops around the ridge and back down into town. I'd started later than I meant to, and the sun was already low behind the hills when I began heading back. The air had that heavy, still feeling it gets right before it turns dark. You could hear every step of your boots on gravel. About halfway down the trail, I stopped to drink some water and happened to glance across the valley. Through the trees, way off in the distance, I caught this quick flash, silver, almost metallic, just a sliver of it between the branches. It wasn't sunlight hitting something, because the sun was already dipping below the ridge. It was more like something reflective moved for a split second and then was gone. I stared for a good minute, waiting for it to reappear, but nothing moved. I shook it off and kept walking. The trail narrowed as it wound down the slope, and the light was fading faster than I liked. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind. But about 10 minutes later, I noticed something behind me. Low, rolling tires on gravel. I turned and saw a black SUV creeping along the trail. It was odd because this fire road was usually gated off to vehicles, except for the occasional Ranger truck. This wasn't a Ranger truck. It was a big, shiny SUV, spotless despite the dusty road. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I slowed down, figuring they might just want to pass, but they stayed behind me, maybe 40 or 50 feet back, moving at my pace. I stepped to the side of the trail, giving a little wave for them to go ahead. The SUV slowed even more, but didn't pass. It just kept rolling forward as I started walking again. My phone had no service out there, so calling anyone wasn't an option. After another minute, the driver's side window rolled down halfway. There were two men inside, both wearing black suits, white shirts, and black ties. Out here. On a dusty fire road in the middle of nowhere, at dusk. Neither of them looked like they belonged anywhere near a hiking trail. The one in the passenger seat just watched me, completely still. The driver, a pale guy with short, dark hair, finally spoke. His voice was flat, like he was reading a script. He asked if I had seen anything unusual up on the ridge. No greeting, no explanation. I said no, because I didn't know what they were talking about, and I wasn't about to mention the silver flash. The driver nodded slightly, but neither of them broke eye contact with me. It wasn't a glare, just staring. The SUV stayed beside me for a few seconds as I walked, rolling along at a crawl until the driver said, "Be careful heading down. Things can change quickly out here." Then the window went back up and they inched forward. I thought they'd finally leave, but they only drove maybe 20 feet ahead before stopping again. I didn't want to walk right up to the back of their vehicle, so I pretended to tie my boot. When I finally kept moving, the SUV started rolling again, matching my pace, just far enough ahead that I couldn't see their faces anymore. The rest of the way down, they never sped up, never pulled away. Every turn in the trail, they'd be there, just far enough ahead to make sure I saw them. The weirdest part was how quiet it all felt. No birds, no wind, no sound, except my own footsteps and the soft crunch of their tires. When we finally reached the bottom of the trail where it met the small gravel parking area, the SUV pulled off to the side. I walked past it, keeping my eyes forward. Neither of the men looked at me this time, but I could feel them watching. I got into my car as quickly as I could. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror. The SUV was still parked there. Then, Right as I turned the last corner before the road back into town, it pulled out and went the opposite direction, up the trail I had just come from. I haven't been back on that ridge since. I was on air until just past midnight, wrapping up my usual late-night talk show about local mysteries and weird news. The station was quiet, the hum of the equipment and the air conditioner the only background. Calls had slowed to a trickle, until this one came through around 12:17 a.m. The voice on the line was calm, almost monotone, but there was this unmistakable tension under it, like the caller was trying not to be overheard. "Hello," I said. "You're on the air." "Yeah," the guy said. "I need to describe something I saw. I don't know who else to tell." He went on to describe it in painstaking detail. A disc-shaped object hovering over a clearing near an old quarry about 20 miles out of town. He mentioned the lights first, soft white circles that rotated slowly, not blinking like aircraft. Then he talked about how it moved, almost imperceptibly at first, then accelerating in ways that didn't make sense. He even described shadows on the ground, like the object was reflecting the trees around it, only in patterns that shifted faster than any reflection should. I was scribbling notes as he spoke, asking questions, trying not to let my skepticism show. He told me the whole encounter lasted maybe 10 minutes, then the object just disappeared. No sound, no sudden liftoff, just gone. And when he got back to his car, the gravel along the edge of the clearing looked undisturbed, like he hadn't even been there. After he hung up, I stayed at the mic for a while, going over the recording and my notes. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the station was empty except for me. I told myself it was just the late hour and too many horror stories swimming in my head. The next morning, I went in around 8. My routine is always the same. Coffee, check messages, back up the previous night's recordings. That's when it started getting weird. 2 men were waiting in the lobby when I walked in, were in suits. Black, conservative, no ties, nothing that stood out except the way they didn't seem to belong there. They didn't introduce themselves properly, just asked for me by name. "We need the recording from last night," one of them said. His voice was neutral, clipped, like he had practiced saying the words 1,000 times. "For archiving purposes, we'll take it from you here." I froze. "Archiving?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can get it off the server, sure, but who?" "Just for documentation," the other said. He was shorter, older, wore glasses that reflected the fluorescent lights overhead. His hands were folded in front of him. "It's important we have the original." I led them to the back office, pulling up the folder on my computer. That's when I noticed the file wasn't there. I just backed everything up last night. I double-checked the timestamps, looked in the trash, even ran a search for any partial files. Nothing. "Strange," I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. "I had it right here, recorded and saved." The taller one leaned over slightly, watching the screen. "You might want to check again. We're sure it's important." I closed the laptop and looked at them. There was something about the way they held themselves, too calm, too deliberate, that made my chest tighten. Not threatening, exactly, but precise. Too precise. They didn't argue or make any demands after that. They thanked me politely, left their cards with a simple note about contacting them if anything else came up, and walked out like nothing had happened. The whole encounter was maybe 7 minutes long. By the time the front door clicked shut, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had hacked into the server. Maybe I had misfiled the recording. I even asked the overnight engineer if he'd touched anything, but he swore he hadn't. That evening, I went back to the station, hoping to at least listen to a rough cut from the backup drive I had at home. My apartment felt colder than usual, and I kept glancing toward the window, half expecting to see someone outside in a black suit, just watching. Nothing was there, of course. I plugged in the drive, found the folder, and started scrolling through files. Most of them were normal, phone interviews, music clips, outtakes, but there was no recording of the call. No audio, no empty file, nothing that would indicate it had ever existed. I even checked the cloud backup. Nothing. I remember sitting back in my chair, trying to breathe evenly. Part of me wanted to believe it had been some kind of technical glitch. Another part of me, well, The other part of me was certain those men weren't just any kind of corporate auditors or local officials. They hadn't looked like anyone I'd ever met before, and their interest in a single audio file was way beyond anything that should matter. Um, uh, Over the next few days, I tried to get back to normal, but every time I opened my laptop, every time I heard a knock at the door or the hiss of tires outside, I felt that same edge of unease. Friends would call, ask about the late night shows, and I'd give vague answers, mumbling something about a technical issue. Then there were little things, subtle but off. My neighbors said they saw a black sedan parked across the street that I didn't recognize. I'd go out, and it would be gone. Lights flickered when I was alone in the kitchen. My phone would ring with no caller ID, and when I answered, there was just static. I tried to focus on work. I scheduled interviews, prepared music segments, dealt with the usual complaints and requests from listeners. But the memory of those two men in black, their calm, deliberate presence, kept creeping back into my mind. I started locking my office door, even during the day. I checked the backups obsessively, hoping for some sign of the missing file, some trace of the caller's voice, but it never appeared. A week later, I got a call on my personal phone. No number, just silence on the other end. I didn't answer. Later that night, a car idled briefly outside my apartment. When I looked through the blinds, it was empty. I couldn't tell if someone had been there at all. I told a few colleagues what happened, carefully, without going into details that would sound insane. Most shrugged it off as a prank or a coincidence. Nobody I told seemed concerned about the missing recording. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a coincidence. That the call, the recording, the men, they were all connected. Months passed. The station moved some equipment around. I changed my routine, and I stopped expecting anything unusual. The phone still rings sometimes with silence, and occasionally a black sedan will pass slowly on the street outside. But I haven't seen anyone like those two again. I still remember the way they looked at me, calm and patient, like they were measuring me, not just asking for a file. And I still wonder about the caller, if the details were real or if it was some elaborate setup. I never recovered the audio. Whatever happened to it, it's gone. And I've learned to stop looking for answers where none exist. At least for now. Some nights I lie awake and think about that call, about the lights over the quarry, about the shadows that shouldn't have moved the way they did. And I realize that some things can exist in the world without ever being explained, and that maybe that's exactly how they're meant to be. It was around midnight, mid-August, when I drove out to the edge of the state park with my camera. I'd been into astrophotography for a couple years by then, nothing serious, just long exposures for fun. The Perseid meteor shower was supposed to peak that night, and I knew that spot had almost zero light pollution. I parked at the end of the dirt access road, carried my tripod about 50 yards into an open clearing, and set up. The air was still, crickets going steady, and the sky was completely clear. I had my intervalometer running, taking 30-second exposures one after another. The first few caught some nice streaks, nothing unusual. About an hour in, while reviewing the shots, I noticed something odd in one frame. At first, I thought it was just lens flare. There was this small round light near the top of the image, glowing faintly. But then I checked the next frame, taken 30 seconds later, and it had moved. Not streaked, not blurred like a meteor, just shifted position slightly, like a planet or star might if you waited hours. Except here it had moved against the background stars in half a minute. Curious, I kept scrolling through the sequence. The thing wasn't moving in a straight line. It would jump a little, then stay in place for 2 or 3 exposures, then jump again. In one shot, it looked dim, then in the next, brighter, almost pulsing. What got me was that the movement was opposite the direction of the meteor trails. Everything else was flowing one way across the sky. This thing was going the other way. I didn't see it with my naked eye while shooting, only in the captures. I told myself it was probably a satellite tumbling or something, but I'd never seen one move like that in my photos before. I let the camera keep going for another hour, but by then, the light was gone from the frames. When I got home, I dumped the photos into Lightroom. I cropped a few of the frames with the light and zoomed in. It wasn't perfectly round, looked more like a flattened sphere, metallic with a faint halo around it. The pulsing effect was clear. Dim, then bright, then dim again in a pattern that didn't match camera artifacts I'd seen before. 2 days passed. I hadn't posted anything online yet, was planning to edit a full sequence first. On the third morning, I looked out my kitchen window and saw a black sedan parked across the street. Windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I figured it belonged to a neighbor's visitor. About an hour later, I went out to check my mail. That's when the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Black suit, white shirt, black tie. No sunglasses, which I noticed because his eyes seemed fixed right on me the entire time he walked over. He stopped a couple feet from me and said, in this completely flat tone, "Are you willing to delete the last hour of exposures from August 12th?" I just stared at him. My first thought was that this was some kind of joke, maybe a friend messing with me, but I hadn't told anyone about the weird light yet. I asked who he was. He ignored the question and repeated the same sentence, word for word. His voice didn't even change pitch. I told him I wasn't deleting anything until I knew why. He said nothing for a good 10 seconds, just stood there, staring. Then he turned, walked back to the car, and got in. The sedan pulled away slowly, no plates on the front bumper. That night, I checked the footage from my doorbell camera. The weird thing was, the video froze for exactly the 30 seconds he stood in front of me. The audio kept going, but the image stayed on one frame, me holding the mail, his shoulder just barely in view. When the video unfroze, he was already halfway back to the car. A couple days later, I went back to edit the photos. When I got to the sequence with the pulsing object, the last 15 shots in that set were corrupted. They showed up as black squares with "file cannot be opened" errors. Those had been fine the last time I checked. I still have the earlier frames, the ones where the object first appeared, but I never saw that car again. It started on a Thursday night in early spring. My parents were out late, Mom was at her book club, Dad was working the evening shift at the mill, so I had the house to myself. I was in my room, half listening to music and flipping through stations on the ham radio I'd been messing around with for the last year. I'd bought it secondhand from a guy named Larry, who ran a booth at the county flea market. He showed me the basics, and I'd been slowly figuring out the rest on my own. Usually, I just picked up local chatter, truckers, hobbyists, weather reports. But that night, I landed on something I'd never heard before. It was a voice, but not speaking English, not Spanish either. It didn't sound like anything I recognized, short, clipped words, almost rhythmic, like the speaker was reading from a code book. No music, no static, just this steady stream of syllables. I wrote some of them down in my notebook, like the way they sounded to me. Then the voice stopped, and there was a long pause. I was about to switch frequencies when a different voice came through. This one, slower, deeper. It read out a string of numbers, then repeated them. 43.819, 122.475. I didn't know what they meant. Coordinates maybe, but I didn't check right away. I just sat there, waiting for more, but the frequency went dead. I flipped through every channel I could reach, but I didn't hear anything like it again. I wrote the numbers down under the words I'd copied. The next day after school, I put them into Google Maps. The location was just a patch of woods about 20 miles south of town, near a place called Devil's Hollow. I'd driven past it with my dad before. It's nothing special, just farmland and tree lines. I didn't tell anyone about it. It wasn't like I thought I'd discovered something huge. It was just weird. I kept the notebook in my desk drawer and figured that was that. The knock came the next afternoon, right after I got home from school. 2 men stood on the porch. Both wore black suits with white shirts, black ties. No logos, no badges. One was tall and thin with pale skin and a sharp jawline. The other was shorter, heavier, with dark hair combed straight back. They didn't smile. The tall one said my name, like he was confirming it. Then he asked, "You have a radio set in your room?" I froze for a second. "Yeah," I said. "We'd like to see your radio logs," he said. Not "may we" or "please." Just flat, like it was a given. I didn't move right away. I asked who they were with. The shorter one reached into his coat pocket, and for a second I thought he was going to show me an ID. but he just took out a small black notebook and flipped it open. I couldn't see what was in it from the doorway. He said, "You picked up a transmission yesterday. We need to verify your records." I told them I didn't think I had to give them anything without my parents home. The tall one looked at the other, then back at me. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "We just need to make sure it's logged correctly. It's for your safety." I remember those exact words. For your safety. They didn't fit the way he said them. I told them I could take their information and have my dad call them. They glanced at each other again. The shorter one closed his notebook. "We'll be back," he said. And they turned and walked down the driveway toward a black sedan parked at the curb. I watched from the window as they got in. The car didn't have plates. That night, I checked my notebook. The page with the strange words and numbers was gone, not torn out. Gone, like it had never been there. All the other pages were intact, my handwriting exactly where I'd left it. Just that one entry missing. I kept the radio off for a few days. The following week, I was sitting on my bed doing homework when the radio clicked on by itself. I swear I hadn't touched it. It went straight to static, then the same deep voice came through. 3.819, 122.475. I didn't write it down. That night, I dreamed I was walking through a stand of bare trees. I could hear voices ahead of me, but I couldn't see anyone. The ground under my feet felt soft, almost like wet sand, even though the trees looked like winter. When I woke up, the radio was on again, just hissing static. The power switch was flipped to off, but it was still making noise. I unplugged it and shoved it in my closet. 2 nights later, I was coming home from a friend's place after dark. When I turned onto my street, there was a black sedan parked 2 houses down from mine. The same model, same color as before. As I passed, I glanced through the driver's side window. The tall man from before was sitting there, hands on the wheel, looking straight ahead. He didn't move. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a minute, pretending to check my phone. When I looked up, the car was gone. I haven't used the radio since. My wife, Erin, and I had taken a long weekend to camp out in the desert, a couple hours outside of Moab. We'd been trying to do more trips away from people, just us, a tent, and no cell service. We drove out a winding dirt road for maybe 30 minutes before finding a flat, open patch about a quarter mile from a low ridge. The weather was perfect. Warm during the day, dropping into the low 50s at night, clear skies full of stars. That second night, we were sitting by the fire after dinner. The moon wasn't up yet, so the sky was pitch black, and the stars were so bright it felt like you could reach up and grab them. We weren't talking much, just listening to the faint wind and the occasional rustle from the brush. That's when I noticed something over the ridge. It was a sphere of light, but not like a star or an airplane. It was the size of a car, maybe bigger, and glowing this soft orange-white. It hovered low, maybe 30 feet above the ground, and moved with this smooth, deliberate motion that didn't match anything I'd seen. It wasn't bouncing like a drone in wind, and it wasn't following a straight line like a plane. It was weaving slowly, like it was searching for something. We watched it for a solid minute before Erin asked if I was seeing it too. I told her yes, and we both just sat there staring. It didn't make any sound. No hum, no engine, nothing. Then, without warning, it shifted, just zipped 20 or 30 feet to the side instantly. My brain couldn't even track the motion. It hovered again, then moved straight up until it was almost lost against the stars. Neither of us spoke for a while after it vanished. Eventually, we decided to call it a night, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I saw faint glows out of the tent. The next morning, we packed up and started the slow drive back toward the highway. The dirt road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, so when I saw a black sedan parked across it up ahead, I slowed to a crawl. The car was spotless, shiny like it had just come out of a car wash, which was strange given how dusty the road was. 2 men were standing beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, and black ties. It wasn't just the clothes. They both had the same stiff posture, hands clasped in front of them, and neither was wearing sunglasses, even though the sun was glaring right in their faces. I rolled the window down halfway as we pulled up. One of them stepped closer to my side. His skin looked pale, but not in a sickly way, more like the absence of color. His voice was calm and flat, with no inflection when he said, "We'll need your cameras." I told him we didn't take any pictures, which was technically true. We'd brought my old Canon, but never used it. He didn't react, just repeated, "We'll need your cameras." Aaron leaned forward from the passenger seat and said the same thing, that we hadn't taken any photos. The man stared at me for a second longer, then stepped back. The other man hadn't moved or spoken the entire time. "You can go," the first one said. They both walked back toward the sedan in perfect sync, turned, and got inside without another word. The car pulled to the side just enough for us to squeeze past. As we drove by, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The sedan was still there. A few seconds later, I checked again, and the road behind us was empty. Just open desert stretching back to the ridge. We didn't talk the rest of the way to the highway. I don't know what that light was or who those men were, but I can't stop thinking about the way they said, "We'll need your cameras." Like they already knew exactly what we saw. I was in Bar Harbor last October, hiking the trails along the coast. The weather was perfect for it. Cool but sunny, with that crisp bite in the air you only get right before winter really sets in. I'd been taking pictures all morning, mostly just the coastline and the old Bass Harbor Head Lighthouse. I'm not a professional photographer or anything, but I like messing around with my camera, seeing what I can capture when the light's good. The tide was out, so I climbed down onto the rocks below the lighthouse to get some different angles. There weren't many people around, just a couple of birdwatchers farther up the trail and some fishermen on a boat out in the distance. I stayed down there for about an hour, wandering between the tide pools and snapping photos of the waves. At one point, I remember pointing my camera back toward the lighthouse and catching something shiny in the viewfinder, off to the left, high above the tree line. It wasn't in the shot for long, maybe a second or two before it zipped out of frame. I figured it was just glare off a plane, or maybe a seagull catching the sun weird. I didn't think about it again until later. By mid-afternoon, I was back at the little gravel lot where I'd parked. My plan was to drive into town, grab some dinner, and maybe go through my shots for the day on my laptop. But as I came out of the trailhead, I saw two men standing near my car. They were both wearing black suits and hats, kind of old-fashioned looking, like something from the 50s. At first, I assumed maybe they were with some kind of historical group or filming project, but as I got closer, they both turned toward me in perfect unison. One of them asked, very calmly, "Where did you have your negatives developed?" It threw me for a second. Negatives? Who still uses film? I told them I hadn't developed anything, that I was using a digital camera. They didn't react. The other one just repeated the question, same tone, same wording. Something about the way they stood there, completely still, no shifting weight, no blinking, started to make me feel off. I told them again that it was digital and even held up my camera to show them. One of them stepped closer, not fast, but in this deliberate way that made it hard to keep eye contact. He looked at my camera for a moment, then asked if I had reviewed the exposures. I said no, not yet. They just nodded once at the exact same time and stepped back. The first one told me to take care driving home, and then they both walked down the gravel drive toward the main road. I turned around to put my stuff in the car, and when I looked back, maybe 5 seconds later, they were gone. No vehicle, no sound, nothing. When I finally got back to my rental, I loaded the pictures onto my laptop. That's when I saw it. In one of the lighthouse shots, right between the tower and the tree line, there was a metallic object, perfectly round, like a ball bearing. It was too sharp to be a bird, and it didn't look like a drone. The light was hitting it in a way that made it almost glow. The strangest part? The next morning, when I went to show a friend back home, the file wouldn't open. I still had all the other photos from that day, but that one shot, the one with the object, was just corrupted. It was a little after 9 on a Thursday night, and I was the only one left in the station. That wasn't unusual. Night shifts at the weather service can be pretty lonely, especially when you're on radar duty. I'd been tracking a line of thunderstorms moving in from the west. Nothing severe, just the kind of summer storms that roll in slow and light up the sky for a few hours. I had one monitor pulled up to the live radar sweep, another set to satellite imagery. Everything looked normal until something caught my eye, a return that didn't match the rest of the data. It was small, maybe the size of a compact car if I had to guess, and it wasn't following the wind patterns. It zipped through the leading edge of the storm, slowed down, then cut sharply north like it had made a decision. My first thought was some kind of drone, maybe military, but the speed changes didn't fit. This thing was moving at over 200 knots at one point, then nearly stopped in place for about 3 seconds before darting off again. The oddest part? No transponder signal. Every aircraft I've ever tracked had at least some kind of identifier. I screen captured the sequence, partly out of habit, partly because I wanted to look at it later when I wasn't juggling radar scans. I even zoomed in on one frame where it passed just beneath the densest part of the cloud line. That's when I noticed the faint halo around it, like it was lit from within, but the light didn't scatter like lightning. I saved everything in our shared archive under a nondescript file name and made a note in the log for the next shift. When I came in the next morning, before I'd even had coffee, there were 2 men in the lobby waiting, both in black suits, black ties, white shirts, like they'd stepped out of some old photograph. No badges, no weather service IDs. One of them, tall and thin, did all the talking. He asked if I was the one monitoring Sector 3B the night before. I said yes, still half asleep. He smiled, polite, but in a way that didn't feel like it reached his eyes, and said, "The data you collected has been reclassified. We'll need access to your workstation." I asked who they were with, because that's protocol, and he just repeated, "The data has been reclassified." The other man, shorter, never looked at me directly. He just kept glancing around the room like he was taking mental inventory. I was too stunned to argue. I logged in, let them behind the desk, and stood there while the tall one navigated directly to my saved folder. He didn't even search. He went straight to it, deleted the files, and emptied the recycle bin. Then he moved to the backup drive and did the same thing. It was only after they walked out, without saying a word about who they were, that I realized they hadn't asked for my password. They'd just known it. I figured maybe someone higher up had called them in, so I checked with my supervisor. He had no idea what I was talking about. No visitors had been signed in. No one had scheduled a review of the radar logs. That's when I tried to pull the files from the server. Our system keeps redundant backups, 3 copies in 3 separate locations, so deleting something completely takes multiple steps and permissions. All 3 versions of the files were gone. Not corrupted, not hidden, just like they'd never existed. Later that afternoon, I went back to the radar station and looked at the log I'd left. My note about the anomaly was missing, but the rest of the log was untouched. No edits, no signs anyone had opened it. That night, I drove home in a heavier rain than the forecast had called for. As I was pulling into my driveway, I noticed a black sedan parked down the street. No plates on the front, windows too dark to see inside. I sat in my truck for a minute, watching, but it never moved. The next morning, it was gone. A week later, I got called in for another overnight shift. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that maybe I'd misread the radar or just gotten too little sleep. But halfway through the night, I caught another blip. Same size, same movement, same strange pauses. This time, before I could even think to save it, the signal blinked out. Not faded, just disappeared mid-scan. 10 minutes later, the phone on the desk rang. When I answered, no one spoke. I could hear a faint hum on the line, like electrical equipment, and then a voice, not distorted, just flat, said, "You won't find it again." The line went dead. I haven't told anyone else about it since. I launched the drone from the grassy berm behind the old airfield just as the sun was dropping. The place is half park, half forgotten runway. Tall grass, chain link with a sag in it, a couple of maintenance hangars that smell like oil and dust. I go there when I want open sky and no neighbors yelling about prop noise. That evening, the thermals were good and the light was sharp. I was trying to catch the last of the sun on the control tower for a time lapse. The first thing that felt off was the birds. There were usually swallows skimming over the grass at dusk, but they were nowhere. The air was quiet in a hollow way. No insects either, like someone had turned down the volume on the place. I shrugged it off, sent the drone up, and watched the live feed on my tablet. I'd been flying long enough to trust the way the machine moves. This time, a little after golden hour, something crossed the horizon on the north side of the field. At first, it looked like a lens flare, bright, round, but it moved. It cut across the frame, low over the hangars, then slid into the bank of cloud that had started to gather. The drone clocked it at a blink of speed and then a full stop, right at the cloud base. No sound that I could hear through the tablet, no echo from the field. Then, as if someone had pressed fast forward on reality, it was gone, inside the cloud, too quick for the eye to follow. I hit record out of reflex. I always record everything. What little footage I get is proof when a shot turns out to be something. On playback, the object is a hard-edged disc, not a smear. It hits the cloud bank and the pixels bloom around it for a frame like heat haze, and then nothing. The timestamp showed a clean 1-second gap where the object should have been, the cloud moving the same way before and after. I replayed the segment until my neck cramped. After I landed, I checked the SD card on the bench with a pocket lamp. The footage looked normal on my laptop in the car, except for that second. I uploaded a copy to my external drive and shoved the original card in my pocket. I told myself I'd post it later, call a couple of friends who shoot storms, and ask what they thought. Mostly I wanted someone to tell me I hadn't been tired or seeing things. I didn't sleep well. I kept picturing that blank white where the object entered the cloud. The next morning, I checked emails a few times and went about the day. Late afternoon, I noticed a sedan idling oddly at the far end of my street when I pulled into the driveway. No plates, windows too dark to see through. It sat there a beat longer than it should have, then rolled away. That was the kind of thing I'd usually ignore. You don't have to take every stranger at face value, but the car stayed in my head, and when an unknown number pinged my phone that evening and went straight to silence when I answered, I tightened up. 2 days later, a knock at the door came just after lunch. I wasn't expecting anyone. Through the peephole, there were 2 men. Black suits, no logos, shoes polished the way people polish them when they expect to be stopped in a lobby and asked their name. They didn't look intimidating. They looked like men who practiced not wasting expressions. I let them in because curiosity won over caution. They introduced themselves in a soft way that almost suggested they were handing the choice to me. One of them held out a card with nothing on it. I said I didn't need a card. The taller one smiled very slightly and asked, plain as you would ask for the time, "Where is the SD card from your flight last evening?" The way he said it made my mouth go dry. "You mean the footage? Yeah, I have it. Why?" "For investigation purposes," the other man said, and his voice was low enough to be private. "We need the card." People who want data typically ask for a copy. They ask for files. Asking for the physical card and doing it with that particular tone was its own kind of pressure. I said no at first. I told them I kept backups and could copy anything they wanted. They listened, and the taller man nodded like he accepted the answer without being surprised. "We'll need the card," he said again, softer, "for chain of custody." He used jargon I'd heard only on crime shows and in a few conversations with a friend who works airport ops. Something about the phrasing put me on edge. If this were a prank, it was a detailed one. We stood in my narrow hallway trading small rationalities. I offered to copy the file there, right on my laptop. The men didn't move to sit. The one with the slightly wrinkled sleeve kept his hands folded, as if the idea of touching anything would mess up the situation. "Digital copies can be altered," he said. "We just need the original." His eyes found mine in a way that left no space for a response. The other man watched the ceiling fan turn. I handed over the card. It felt heavier than it should have. He took it with both hands like it was fragile, examined the label on the corner, and slipped it into a small padded envelope. There was a calm, corporate efficiency to what they did. No threats, no small talk, just focus. Before they left, the tall one said, "We appreciate your cooperation. Don't post anything until you've spoken with us again." I asked what department they were from. FAA? Police? Some university? They didn't answer directly. "Investigation," the tall one said. "We'll be in touch." They left the way they had arrived. No car on the street, no footsteps through the yard. For a second after the door shut, I thought I heard a car fade down the block. But there was also the hum of the refrigerator and the kettle starting in the kitchen, so it could have been anything. I tried to get back to regular life. I called my friend Mara, who edits for a local paper. She said she could check footage for lens artifacts or other issues, and she asked if I'd uploaded the file anywhere. I told her I'd given the card to the men. She sounded annoyed on the line, but not surprised. "People who want that kind of thing don't say investigation and leave envelopes with manners," she said. "They have forms." The next evening, the local news ran a short about some pilots who'd reported an errant drone near the airfield. The story said nothing about discs or missing frames. It quoted a source from airfield ops who said the issue was resolved. I watched it twice and felt a lump in my throat because the station footage showed the exact stretch of fence where I'd taken off, empty and ordinary. A week later, no one called, no email, no official badge in the mail. I kept checking the envelope. Its flap had been sealed with tape, then opened, then taped again. The card was gone. That night, I found another car in my street, different make, the same quiet waiting. I sat at my table until 2 a.m. with the kitchen light on and the tablet beside me. But I didn't fly anything. The drone hummed in its bag on the shelf, the battery cool. I plugged the external drive into the laptop and scrolled through footage folders, looking for the copy I had made right after the flight. The backup file was there, but when I opened it, the timeline leapt a few seconds. Where the object had entered the cloud was a black frame, and then, one frame later, the cloud was in a slightly different place. The encoding showed no errors, nothing corrupted, just a clean jump like a cut someone had made. I thought about going to the station and asking questions. I thought about posting the clip online. I thought about how small and explainable my life usually felt. Instead, I shut the laptop and walked to the window to see if the car had moved. It was gone. 2 weeks later, a man in a plain suit left a small, anonymous envelope on my porch. Inside was one single printout, a still from my footage, the frame before the object hit the cloud. They'd cropped it so tight, the disc filled the page like a coin. Someone had printed it on nice paper, not my printer. On the back was, "Please exercise discretion," and nothing else. I taped the print to the inside of my storage cabinet where I keep propellers and spare batteries. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know what they are. I don't know whether handing the card over calmed something or started something. All I know is that the birds haven't quite returned to the airfield the same way they used to. And when I stand on the berm at dusk, it feels stranger to look at the clouds. I still fly sometimes, but I always set the recorder to save to 2 cards and 1 drive, and I keep a copy physically separated, just in case. I walked through the fence at the old municipal airfield just after sunrise because it felt like the only quiet place left in town. The weeds had taken over the taxiways, the tower was half collapsed, and the gusts off the river rolled across the tarmac in long, lazy waves. I'd been coming here for years with a camera, chasing the way light hits rust and concrete. That morning, the sky was a low, clean gray, and the air tasted like river peat. It was the sort of weather that makes the colors in old metal pop. I headed toward the far lot where the maintenance hangars sat in a line. The gate I crawled under was easy to spot. Orange tape, a faded no trespassing plaque that looked like it had been there since the 70s. The runway, which had once been a smooth ribbon, was cracked with grass poking up through seams. There was no traffic, no construction crew, nothing to suggest anyone would be out there except me and the occasional raccoon. About halfway down the 3rd taxiway, I saw it, an aircraft I'd never seen before, sitting just beyond the row of hangars, as if someone had set it down and left the parking lights on. It wasn't much to look at from where I stood. Matte, dark paint, smooth skin, no visible registration numbers or markings. It had the basic silhouette of a light twin, but the tail surfaces were unusual, the wings narrower and swept in a way I couldn't match to any model in my head. The oddest bit was how quiet it was. No engine ticks, no venting hisses. Nothing. If it had landed recently, you would think someone would be moving around, cranking avionic fans or tow vehicles, but the lot was silent, except for the river and the distant highway. My first instinct was to raise the camera. I creep around in abandoned places because not many people do, and the airfield had given me a dozen shots I liked for years. I stepped off the taxiway onto the grass and padded closer, stitching the viewfinder with my thumb, trying to frame the fuselage between two broken light towers. A flock of starlings exploded out from the weeds under my feet, as if I'd set them off with a thought. They went up and away, and then, for a second that took an extra beat to register, all bird noise stopped. Not faded, removed. It was like someone had hit mute on wildlife. I heard it then, or rather I didn't. Where the aircraft sat there should have been a motor whisper or a cooling fan. There was nothing. Even my camera's autofocus sounded louder than whatever kept the plane lying there. That silence felt deliberate, like the air was answering to a rule. When I was maybe 60 yards out, I noticed another detail. The concrete under the tires looked a touch darker, like something had been spilled and wiped, but not entirely. There was a faint ring of dust, the kind you see where a weight has been sitting for a while. It gave me the impression the plane had been there a while, not 5 minutes ago. I took a couple of shots and thumbed through them. The body looked like a clean matte skin in the LCD, almost too perfect. The camera pinged preview thumbnails into the screen, and the little battery icon blinked down one notch. I made another pass around the side to get a profile, and then felt very plainly that I wasn't alone. They stepped out from behind Hangar C. 2 men. Same black suits, same narrow ties, same short-cropped hair, same shoes shined too clean for the place. They were maybe 10 paces from me, and they hadn't made enough noise to rustle the grass. They were just there, like someone unlatched a curtain, and a pair of figures stood in the gap. One of them tilted his head as if noting the sky. The other studied the aircraft. Neither moved with haste. They had that practice slow-motion people who spend a lot of time being watched seem to learn. Calm, economical, never reaching. "You're not supposed to be here," the taller one said, which is a polite way of saying trespass. I had a half second to work out if this was a landowner, a cop, or some private security firm. There were no badges, no ID, just their suits and an even, measured cadence to their speech. Not a threat, there wasn't anything menacing about the tone, but not the friendly shoo from a ranger either. "I know," I said. "Just shooting photos. I come here a lot." The shorter man checked my camera strap with a single glance. "You saw it land," he said, not a question. "Yeah, maybe," I replied. "Or it's been here longer and I just..." He interrupted, slow so it landed like a statement. "This area is under quarantine." I wanted to laugh because quarantine made no sense here. There were no hazardous material placards, no hazmat trucks, nothing. Quarantine implied contamination or danger. The taller man folded his hands in front of him and smiled in the way people do when they've been asked to be reasonable about an unreasonable request. "For everyone's safety, you'll leave the site," he said. "We'll need your cooperation." They didn't ask for the photographs, which surprised me. They didn't ask me to delete anything from the card or let them see the files. It felt like an omission, like someone had decided to take a soft approach and let the implied force do the work. I fished in my pocket for my phone because people ask to see the files or make an authoritative request in writing. I'd seen that script before in places where agencies want to avoid paper. When the screen came alive, the bars for reception were gone, the usual 4G icon replaced by a small dash. The camera's battery meter flicked and then steadied on the LCD as if someone touched the circuits from outside. "Out," the shorter man repeated. "Now," I told them. I didn't want trouble, and I started back the way I'd come, boots crunching on broken glass. I kept my eyes on the aircraft the whole time, careful not to run and not to reach back for another shot. The men didn't follow, but they watched every step until I crossed the wire fence and padded under the sagging gate. By the time I reached the small bridge over the drainage ditch, the suits were gone. There was no car, no footprints, no sign they'd ever been anywhere but in my mind. I reached for my phone to call the station, or the non-emergency line, and the dial tone was a silence like a held breath. I drove home slow enough, my mirrors could still catch an angle of the field. The plane was still there when I passed, but from the road it looked smaller, less present, like it had retreated into the airfield. I spent the afternoon trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I uploaded the card to my laptop and copied the raw files, then zoomed in on the frames. There were the expected details: rivets, faded paint strokes, small smudges. The frame where I'd walked around the nose had a glint of something reflective, and then a strip where the pixels looked squished like a frame drop. There was no sound recorded beyond the muffled wind the mic always picks up. I called the county office to ask if they'd put any restriction on the old field. The woman I reached in land management paused like she was searching a map and then said, "There's nothing listed. No notices, no quarantine. The airfield's been default county property for years." That didn't mean much. Governments leave strange gaps on maps. But over the next 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about the way the men had appeared and how they didn't ask for the photos or my gear. They simply told me to leave. A friend who flies crop dusters swung by and we went back to the runway at dusk because my curiosity and his, maybe there's a new registry they're testing, logic outweighed my better judgment. We parked in the scrub a half-mile out and watched. The plane was gone. The concrete where it had sat looked scrubbed clean, darker in an irregular oval. We walked closer and my friend knocked it with his knuckles like you do on a car door. Nothing inside, nothing left behind. No wheel marks on the dirt, no dragged tire tracks through the grass, just a place that had recently held weight and now didn't. When we got back to the truck, my friend asked if I'd filed a report. I told him no, I didn't know who you'd file that with. He asked if the suits had asked for the footage. I said they hadn't. He squinted at me in that way friends do when they suspect the explanation is simple and stupid. "You should make copies," he said. "Keep them somewhere else. Keep them in the cloud." I agreed, and then uneasily realized if my phone had lost signal the day I left the card in my pocket, whatever made that happen could come back. That night, I found a scrap of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was white, just a rectangle with neat printed text that said, "Area under quarantine. Do not return." No agency, no number, nothing. I threw it away after I took a picture of it with my phone, except when I tried to look at the shot, the file wouldn't open. It said corrupted. I haven't gone back since. I still dream about the way the sky went mute when the birds lifted. I still think about the men in suits and how calm they'd been saying quarantine like it was normal. I kept a backup of the other photos on an old drive shoved into the back of a filing cabinet, half because I couldn't bring myself to get rid of them, and half because someone had once told me about records that disappear if you leave them online. I checked the drive this morning and the folders were there, but the sequence where the plane had been was one frame shorter, as if the morning itself had taken a breath and spat it out a second later. If you asked me what I'd do differently, I don't know. I'd like to think I'd push closer or call someone with authority, but the men were polite and correct, and the hush of that place felt heavier than trespass. For now, I tell myself, I'm lucky I left with no fuss. I also tell myself not to go back, which is the same thing. I was coming down off the ridge when the cornfield stopped being a cornfield. It was late July, the kind of dry, heat-soaked dusk where the air trembled above the highway. I'd been on my wheels since before dawn, load of feed out of Indiana, headed west, and I'd been watching fields for hours just to keep my eyes from glazing over. I remember thinking how ordinary everything looked. Rows and rows, tractors in the distance, the smell of dust when a car passed. Then, maybe a half mile off the shoulder, something was hovering right over the stalks as if it had decided to park there. It was triangle-shaped, flat on the bottom like an upturned wedge, the points notched with small, dim lights. It hung maybe 40, 50 feet up, low enough that the corn tops bowed a little where whatever it was cast a shadow. There was no sound, not a hum, not the whining of props, just the same insects and road noise I'd been hearing for miles. It didn't move like anything mechanical I knew. It rolled slow, like it was reading the field with some kind of even motion, then tilted and drifted a few yards and stopped. I pulled off into an old farm turnout and killed the engine because I didn't trust the bass in the cab would keep me from hearing something. The truck sat and settled. The radio died down. The air felt thick and close, like the world had been squeezed and the center pressed flat. A flock of starlings had been peppering the field a minute before, then they were gone. I scanned the tree line and the sky, expecting a crop duster or a banner or something sensible. Nothing. Just that triangular silhouette against a strip of bruised clouds. I grabbed my phone and hit record because it felt like the right thing to do, the only thing. The battery icon was solid. The camera showed the shape in the distance like it was in every other video I'd taken. Then the screen fuzzed. Not pixelation like a bad cell tower, more like the image and the real thing stopped lining up. I could see it with my eyes as clear as my windshield, but the phone's live view behaved like someone had put a hand in front of the lens for a second. One heartbeat of black, and when it came back, the triangle was a shade to the left. The phone logged the video and the file acted fine, but the second where the object jerked didn't look like any glitch I knew. I stood there until the light faded and it eased up and away into the low clouds, a small dark shape swallowed by gray. I felt stupid calling dispatch over it, but I radioed my dispatcher anyway. Something odd at mile marker 52 over the Briggs farm. And the reply was the kind of clipped, neutral thing meant to make a man stop talking. Copy. Keep rolling. You don't get a lot of time to make decisions. I sat in the cab until the stars blurred. I wanted to do two things. Drive on until I was out of whatever that was, and call someone who'd give me an answer, or get down in the field and poke through the corn to find out if anything was missing. The first is the habit of a man whose paycheck comes from staying moving. The second was a kind of foolishness I kept myself from indulging. I made myself drive. The highway was empty and the cab was cool. The lane lights rattled past. I kept checking the side mirror though, thinking I'd see the thing again, and sometimes I thought I could. Some crooked, hard-to-place outline on the horizon, but it could just have been memory playing tricks. My next planned stop was at a small interstate truck plaza, a blue roof place with a diner that did good pie. I figured I'd get coffee, stretch, and that would be it. Maybe my stomach or the pie or sleeping shift would quiet whatever attention the sky had put on me. I pulled into the lot and parked in my usual row. That's when I saw them. Two men in black, standing together near the end of the convenience store where the propane tanks sit. They were spaced a little too perfectly, like bookends. Both had on dark suits, narrow ties, shiny shoes, the kind of unruffled getup you see in movies when someone mysterious steps out of a cab. They were watching the lot, watching the traffic, and watching me. I got out of the truck slow and went to the restroom like it was the most ordinary thing I could do. When I came back, the men were still there. A woman in a reflective vest filled her water jug at the pump, and they didn't turn their heads. The cashier at the window kept glancing at the door, then back to the register. I could feel the way the men looked at me without moving their heads. Just eyes like two lenses fixed on a point. They didn't enter the store, they didn't stand in line, they didn't buy coffee or a pack of smokes. They just stayed at that end of the lot and watched the lot, watching people, watching me. It made me want to leave my coffee and donuts and get back behind the wheel and roll off the lot. I had this ridiculous urge to back up and pull out because staying would give them a chance to do something. It sounded ridiculous even in my head, like one of those thoughts you get when sleep is catching up, but I felt it all the same. I walked over to the air and stretched, fingers under my shirt, trying to keep it casual. One of them shifted his weight for the first time since I'd seen them. Not toward me in a way that suggested movement. Just the smallest reach, the slightest turn so that his shoulder lined up with mine. Identical faces, I realized then. Same jawline, same eyes, same expressionless mouth. And they were both focused like the lot was a stage. No cashier came outside. No security walked up. A handful of drivers went about their business, oblivious. I tried the polite smile, the small signal human gesture drivers use to diffuse things. Nothing. They didn't smile back. They didn't blink much, if you noticed. Men in black at a rest stop. There's a kind of joke cab chatter about that, about conspiracy hours and encounters, and usually it's laughed at over coffee. I thought of the dispatcher's voice saying, "Keep rolling," and realized again I had no goddamn sense of where to put this. My friend Luis calls me brave for showing him the video on my phone later that night. I couldn't have shown it if I'd scanned the footage first, because the clip had an odd jump exactly where the object crossed the frame, like someone had spliced a different bit of cloud in. The audio track had a second of high, thin static that looked like a recorded squeal on the wave, then nothing. Luis leaned back and blew out a breath and said, "Keep your ears open." He meant, of course, the sensible thing. Keep your eyes and ears open while you drive and don't do anything stupid. At some point during those coffee and pie minutes, I went and bought the pie. I set it on the passenger seat because habit says a man shouldn't get on the road hungry. When I came back out, the two men were still standing there. The sun had dipped a little more. They were unmoving in that way that made them look like part of the furniture. I got in the truck, started the engine, and pulled out. They watched me leave. No hand waves, no approach, just the watching. I told myself it was coincidence. Men in suits parked because they liked the spot or were working on something official. But when I passed a second rest area an hour down the road just to stretch again, I saw a sedan parked under the far light. No one near it. The driver's door was closed. The license plate was clean. From the angle I got as I rolled by, I could have sworn I saw someone in a dark suit sitting perfectly still on the passenger side, staring forward. I haven't said anything to my company about the craft or the men. I filed a short note in my log. Saw unknown object over Briggs Farm. Photo saved. That's where it sits. It reads small, like a man who is trying to make a brush mark in a ledger and not a confession on a blog. At home that night, my daughter asked why I smelled like diesel and pie. She wanted to know about the sky looking orange on the way in. I said the usual, the highway, heat, a long day. We ate and watched cartoons, and I put the phone away. I don't know who the men were or why they didn't buy anything or why one of them had a tie that didn't move in the breeze. I don't know whether whatever was over the Briggs farm was watching something or looking for something, or whether I'd been the only human who happened to notice. All I know is that when the lot was full of drivers, coffee to go, diesel fumes, the little clutter and noise of people running short errands, two men in black stood at the edge and did nothing but watch. I kept rolling. The pay is good for the miles, and the miles are my business. If it is anything else, it hasn't told me yet. I was on the roof because the roof is the only place in my block that still has darkness enough to see anything beyond the sodium street lamps. I'd set the telescope up between the rusting HVAC units and a dying potted palm, tripod feet on the gravel, red headlamp tucked into my jacket so I wouldn't wreck my night vision. My name's Marco Reyes. I'm not an astronomer, just someone who likes to point expensive glass at empty bits of sky and try to make sense of the small things moving up there. The night was the kind of cold that sharpens edges. Late October, clear, with a thin crescent moon. I was logging the Cassiopeia sweep when my planet tracking app pinged a satellite pass. I always check satellites. They move like they're on rails. This didn't. At first I saw 4 points of light, evenly spaced, crawling across the sky as if someone had snapped a line of LEDs into place. They held formation perfectly. No drift, no jitter. Just that quiet, mechanical glide. Then they did something that made me sit back from the eyepiece because it made no sense in any of the little rhythms I knew. The formation split. Not a diffusion or a scattering like a flock of birds, but a clean break. The 4 points arranged into a square, then 2 points slotted inward to make a diamond. And suddenly one of the points folded inward on an angle so sharp it looked like the light had just stopped being a dot and was now an edge. The motion was instantaneous, like a page flipping. I blinked and the thing had changed again, corners forming and reforming, more geometry than flight. I checked the scope for reflection, tapped the eyepiece, thought maybe an internal glitch. The live feed on my phone showed the same thing, just smaller, so it wasn't me hallucinating. I started recording because that's what you do when something refuses to behave. You make a copy, so later you can argue with it. The lights moved with that odd, clean choreography for maybe 3 minutes. They'd push in, snap apart, slide sideways without the faintest arc, vanish for a blink and reappear a fraction of a degree away. No sound at all. The air on the roof was ordinary, traffic down the avenue, a dog barking once, a far plane. But the motion itself had the wrong physics. Sharp turns that would tear apart any aerodynamic surface, pauses that weren't pauses but jumps. After 10 minutes, I felt stupid and small and intensely awake all at once. The sky settled back into its normal scatter. An airplane crossed with its blinking nav lights, a satellite that actually behaved like a satellite. I packed the scope away with my hands, still a little clumsy. I thumbed the recording and saw the file, the little thumbnail moving, but when I tried to open it, my phone choked. File corrupted, the media app said, which is the polite way electronics tell you you don't own the moment you thought you owned. I shrugged and went inside because it was late and because there's always the argument that rooftops have the best ghosts. The next morning, I had to get up for work at the public library downtown. I've been the evening reference librarian there for 3 years. The job is mostly lending answers and shushing teenagers. Library work is sensible, which is why what happened after the roof felt strange on top of strange. I walked out of the staff entrance at 8:15 and 2 men were on the sidewalk across the street. I noticed them because the morning felt ordinary, and then the men were there. 2 dark silhouettes in suits unlike anything you see on a Tuesday outside a library. Black wool, narrow ties, shoes so clean they looked new. They were standing under the awning of a closed storefront, both staring in the exact direction of the library entrance. They weren't talking, they weren't shifting weight, they were just watching. There was something about them that made my stomach drop slow and precise. The way they held still like a camera prevents motion blur. The sameness of their posture, the way they avoided buying coffee or even pretending to check their phones. It was the way movie extras look when the director hasn't called wrap. I told myself I was being childish. Maybe they were waiting for a friend. Maybe they were private security. People wait on sidewalks all the time. I changed my route to the front door because the staff entrance was closer. But as I passed the window of the bakery across the street, I caught them out of the corner of my eye. Still there, still watching. Inside, I couldn't focus. Someone asked me where the genealogy microfilm was, and I pointed and then had to go back and look at the copy of the roof video I'd finally managed to force into existence on my backup drive. The file opened this time, but there was a single frame where the lights folded inward that was pure white, like someone had erased that instant. I scrubbed back and forth, and the white frame stayed the size of a single heartbeat. At 11, I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well. He raised an eyebrow. People call in for colds all the time, but I could see him thinking it over and deciding the day would pass without me. When I walked back out to the staff entrance, the 2 men were closer now, under the plane trees by the newsstand, still staring at the library door. They hadn't budged. They didn't follow me. They didn't approach. They merely stood and watched in that slow, spectator silence until I rounded the corner and started home with my chest a little tight and the afternoon wide open. The whole way back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting them to be driving behind me the way men in suits in bad movies do. The street was empty, except for a delivery van. The world had its usual noise. Trains, a kid on a bicycle, someone on a lawnmower. I should have called someone. Police, a friend, a manager, but the rational options reeked a little of overreaction. Excuse me, there are 2 men staring at my workplace doesn't sit comfortably in the phone. Instead, I sat on my couch and tried to make sense of the white frame. I tried to find the moment again on my site clipboard, dug the backup card out of the glove box, but a day later, the file behaved differently. The recording would play up to the white frame and then, as if bored, jump forward a second and resume. Not corrupted, altered in a way that looked like someone had edited the world's continuity. Over the next 48 hours, other little things piled up around that first weirdness. My apartment clock lost 7 minutes and then caught back up. My neighbor told me her baby monitor recorded a burst of static at 2 a.m. No voice, no melody, just a thin sweep like the breath of old radio tubes. My phone battery drained faster than it had any right to. The weather app on my tablet showed rain for the afternoon the next week, and then, when I checked again, a different forecast. Small, plausible glitches, each one wearing the shape of coincidence. On Wednesday, I went back to work. I said I'd been clear-headed all morning, and meant it at first until I rounded the newsstand and the men were there again. A little further down, still in their suits and still watching the door like they were cataloging the comings and goings. A mother with a stroller paused and looked at them and then hurried away differently, like her sense of a normal morning had shifted. A bus driver swapped a look with a shopkeeper and then shrugged it off. The men kept watching. When I left early again at lunchtime, they watched me a while longer. From the sidewalk, their faces were as blank as copies. No sunglasses to hide eyes, nothing to anchor them to the rest of the city. I kept my head down and walked. The whole time I had the odd sensation that they knew which pocket held the telescope key, that they had the white frame of my video memorized like a schedule. I thought about parking across town for the evening, about sleeping at a friend's, about changing my clothes and vanishing for a night, but I didn't do any of those things. I walked home because habit is a tie. That night I tried to be ordinary. I cooked pasta, I did the dishes, I pretended the sky was the same sky. The topaz of the streetlight through the blinds looked the same as it ever did. I left a red headlamp in the drawer by the door, just in case. When I closed my eyes, the white frame was a bright, jagged thing behind my eyelids. I don't know what those lights were on the roof. I don't know who the men were on the sidewalk. I don't know whether the missing frame is a hole someone cut in time, or a bad app, or a trick of electronics colluding with my nerves. All I know is that the city felt a little watched for a while, like when you notice a new camera and can't unsee it. I also know I left work early 2 days running and that 2 men in suits stood across the street both times and did nothing but look until I was gone. We were driving home on Route 47 just after midnight when I first noticed the light. Maya was dozing in the passenger seat. Eli, our 8-year-old, was halfway through a pack of crackers in the back, and the baby monitor on the dash hissed with the low rhythm of our daughter sleeping. The rain had come through earlier and the road was slick, everything reflecting the highway lamps in long, smeary ribbons. I had the radio on low, one of those talk shows that made good road noise. It was the kind of ordinary drive you don't think twice about, 2 hours from my sister's place to our driveway. And then this dot hovered off to our right, a little higher than a telephone pole, glowing soft and white. At first I thought it was a drone. There are hobbyists around here who fly over the fields sometimes. It didn't move like a plane, though. It didn't have the slow sweep of a chopper, and there was no blinking red light like an aircraft. It just hung there, a small, steady glow. I slowed, mostly because the stretch of road had a curve, and watched it. It tilted a few degrees as if to adjust its angle. Then, rather than continuing in a straight line, it fell into step with us, keeping pace at maybe 20 miles an hour off to our right. "You see that?" I said, more to myself than to Maya. She opened one eye and then shut it again. Eli craned his neck around and said, "Is that a star?" in the voice of someone who had an answer in mind and wanted validation. It kept the same distance, the same bearing. When I accelerated a bit to pass a slow-moving tractor, the light did the mechanical thing you'd expect a tailored object to do. It moved with the same acceleration, matching our speed. It wasn't wobbling or battling wind. It tracked us as if it were tethered invisibly to the car. We pulled into the Maple Grove gas station out of habit. Maya likes the bathrooms there, and Eli wanted more crackers. I killed the engine, and the air inside the cab felt louder. The light was still there, hovering a little beyond the pumps, an unnatural punctuation against the gray sky. I stepped out and the wet asphalt smelled like poured concrete. The station lights made the puddles sparkle. The dot didn't change. A black sedan eased into the space 2 pumps down without hitting the lights. No one waved or opened a door. It sat, engine ticking like it had just come from a drive. 2 men got out. Black suits, black ties, pale shirts, nothing printed on the suits, no lanyards, no logo. One of them walked with his hands folded at his front, the way some people do when they don't want to fidget. The other kept his gaze level, moving his head only to look at the pumps, as if he were checking the price board. We were the only car in the small convenience lot that looked like an ordinary family mistake. Headlights on, pillows half sticking out of the back. I remember thinking there was no reason for anyone in a suit to be here at that hour, unless they'd missed a flight or were bored. I went inside with Eli, and Maya followed because she always likes to check the refrigerated section before buying anything. The men stood by the sedan and watched. The attendant at the counter, Tom, who knows half the county by voice, made some small joke about the rain and the power coming back on a few nights ago. He glanced at the men, then at the pumps, then at me, like he was gauging whether our presence would complicate his night. He didn't say anything about the suits. By the time we were back at the car, the black sedan's passenger had approached us. He didn't hurry. He moved with an economy that made me think he'd practiced the gesture 1,000 times and found the one that didn't betray him. His face was unremarkable in a way that made it harder to place anything about him afterward. Too neat, a kind of corporate neutrality. "You folks should take a different route home," he said. Nothing in his voice suggested threat, and nothing suggested concern. It was like being told the weather report. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't give a reason. He looked at me and then at Maya as if he were seeing a benign traffic decision rather than the small story of a family driving late. "Excuse me?" I said, because that seemed like the normal answer. He repeated it. "Different route." I was tired and wanted to get on the road, and the rational things lined up against me. Maybe there was an accident ahead, maybe a fallen tree, maybe he'd seen something on his way. I asked, "Is there a detour sign? Is something blocked up Route 47? He glanced at the pumps, then back. "We advise it." That was the word he used. Advise. He turned his head a fraction, and the other man came close enough to be a shadow behind him. Maya had the keys in her hand and was already buckling Eli into the booster. "Look," she said, soft, like she was trying not to be rude to someone who could be a helpful stranger. "We're set on our way. Are you with the county?" The man's mouth didn't move much when he smiled. It was a small, practiced line that reminded me of salesmen or people who give the same presentation 80 times a month. "We work with interests that prefer discretion," he said. "It's better if you avoid the lowland." The lowland. The word landed in my head with a dull thump. The highway had a stretch that dipped near the old mill, low and flat, where water pooled if the rain was heavy. We drove it any time we came back from family. Shorter, and I liked the way the road meandered through the trees at night. I thought about the puddles that could hide a washed-out culvert. I thought about the car behind us, idling like a piece of chess waiting on a square. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, because it seemed the polite thing to do. We had no idea who he was, but anyone could have a tip about a closure or a detour. He nodded small and sideways and returned to his sedan. The other man got in. The car pulled away without rolling through the pumps, no turn signal, no idle, and vanished on the far edge of the lot like someone undoing a scene. We left too, taking the road he suggested, which cut us wide through the ridge instead of the lowland. The dot followed us out the station like it had before, perfectly matched speed exactly beside us. But when we eased onto the back road, the light hung back for a beat and then vanished as if never there. I kept thinking about what the man had said. Interests that prefer discretion sounded like a phrase you'd get from lawyers or from people who don't want to be named. I imagined any number of plausible officials. Utility crews, DOT contractors, a sheriff's deputy out of uniform. I thought of calling the station's non-emergency line and asking. I didn't. The idea of officialness felt bigger than the cost. It felt like a thing that would complicate the drive home. On the ridge road, the night tightened. The trees made themselves shapes against the sky. Eli fell asleep between the glow of his crackers and the hum of the heater. Maya's head bobbed once, twice, as she drifted. I drove slower than usual because the rain had left the asphalt glossy and treacherous. No car followed us. No headlights bobbed in the distance. When we pulled into the driveway, I left the engine running for a minute as if there were salve in the noise. I kept an eye on the rear view for a while after phoning my sister to thank her for the dinner. No black car. No light. The night was ordinary again, our lawn lights diffused, the baby monitor static a familiar sibilance. I thought about the man's advise and filed it under that bucket you put things in when you don't know what else to do. Inexplicable, mildly unnerving, to be told like a weather forecast. In the morning, I went back out to check the dashcam footage, something I hadn't done in years because drones and phones are messier than memory. The camera recorded us pulling into the station, but the section where the dot hovered beside us showed one clean frame where it should have been, and then a second later, the cloud-reflected pump lights at the edge of the lot. The clip played as if someone had trimmed out a beat, like a seam edited from a tape. The timestamps jumped. My phone's files behaved the same. The photo I'd meant to take of Eli I eating crackers on the back seat had the metadata for the station, but the image preview froze for half a second when I opened it and then moved on like nothing was wrong. I thought about calling someone official. I thought about going down the lowland to see what he'd hinted at, to look for a barricade, a cop car, a note on the roadside. But these are the choices you make with a family in the back seat. You choose the easiest risk to manage. I made a pot of coffee, drove Eli to school, and called my shift in at work. I did what every man my age does when his hair follicles insist the world is stable. I went to my job, I answered emails, I watched people buy tickets and change their plans, I filed paperwork. At lunch, an hour after the kids were napping, I walked past the station without thinking. That's the kind of place you walk past when you want gum or a cheap sandwich, and it was full of the same humming light. A crew in orange cones were off to one side setting up a board that said "Bridge work ahead" in flapping letters. I walked inside and asked the attendant if they'd put that sign up last night, and he shrugged. "Folks always put up signs when they want to be careful," he said. He didn't know the men in suits. No one else had seen them. I still have the clip on a backup drive, and I keep going back to that brief, quiet hole in the footage, the way you return to an old bruise and prod it gently to see when it hurts. I don't know who those men were, who they worked for, whether they meant to help or to redirect us for their own reasons. I don't know why the dot kept pace with us, or how it knew our turns. The safe choices we made that night, taking the ridge instead of the lowland, not pulling off to investigate, kept us from being stranded in a washed-out culvert or from talking to someone who might have given us an answer. We got home. We made breakfasts. Eli drew a picture of a car with headlights and a star and taped it to the fridge. Sometimes at night, on clear evenings when the sky is full, I look at the stretch of lowland and try to imagine what I didn't see there, the things people with tidy suits and quiet voices keep in the margins. The memory of that man at the pump sticks in the way small warnings do, the kind you remember when you drive past a sign and, for no good reason you can name, take the long way anyway. I was already out on the deck when the dog started behaving like something was wrong. He didn't bark so much as hold his breath, head up, ears stiff. And because I've had the dog long enough to trust his instincts, I followed his stare up past the maple and the power lines into the sky. My name is Ben Morales. I live on the edge of town where the lights thin out and the Milky Way shows up on a good night. I'm not an astronomer by trade. I work at the library, and I like to spend clear evenings with a Dobsonian and a thermos of coffee. That night, the air was the kind of cold that makes glass sing. The dew point had dropped, and the stars were hard and clean. I had the scope aimed near Cassiopeia, checking a double star I hadn't looked at in years. At first, the object just looked like a star out of place, a bright point drifting faster than an aircraft should. Then it did something I had no quick explanation for. It skipped. Not a smooth curve, not the steady line a satellite makes, but a literal hop. It moved, froze, then appeared again a short distance away, like the sky had a hiccup and a light popped. I've seen meteors, shot-ups from launch sites, helicopters. This wasn't any of them. The jumps were sharp and precise, and they happened more than once. The thing didn't blaze or leave a trail. It moved like someone animating a dot on a screen. I grabbed my phone and pointed the scope's red dot so I could run the tracking app. The app showed the point hopping too, a little blip that recentered itself in the feed with the same tiny disappearances. I started recording video because that's what you do, proof, and also because it's the only way to look at something later without the adrenaline messing with your head. The camera ran, the mount hummed, and the object kept its odd pattern. After about 8 minutes, it vanished in a way that was exactly as unsettling as it sounds. Not like it faded, not like it accelerated away, but like a frame was deleted. 1 second there were jumps. The next, the patch of sky where it had been was empty and ordinary. The whole stretch had a soft white haze, where the starfield looked wrong on playback, and the recording app complained about a frame drop when I scrolled back. My laptop told me the file was fine. It wasn't. I emailed a friend from the astronomy club, Claire, because she knows more than I do and because I knew she'd enjoy the mystery. She called back half an hour later and made me replay the clip while she listened. "That's not a meteor," she said. Huh. That was Claire's version of being unsettled. The first odd thing arrived between me setting the scope down and making coffee. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't have saved. 000000. Blank message. No content. Then the radio in my old car, which I keep as a backup, gave one long, thin scratch like a record stuck and then went quiet. I told myself it was coincidence, old electronics, a glitchy local tower, and that's what I told Claire over a second call. She laughed because she knows I'll look for patterns, and she told me not to lose sleep. I said I wouldn't. 2 days later, the pattern got heavier. It started small. The copy of the video I uploaded to the cloud had one single frame that wouldn't show. Where the object popped and vanished, the stream froze to pure white for a fraction of a second. My backup SD card reported a bad sector when I tried to copy it locally. When I took the card to Claire, she'd offered to check the raw file on her setup. Her computer opened the folder and then the folder closed. No read permissions, she said. And that wasn't a phrase I expected from someone who lives by bits and bytes. That afternoon, I noticed a car parked a little too long at the end of my street. It was a dark sedan, the kind of anonymous fleet car you see in movies when someone important is arriving. There were 2 men inside when I walked by, suits, no visible badge, the kind of neat that looks almost rehearsed. They didn't get out. They watched the house. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and pretended to admire the weather, because that's what you do when you're the kind of person who notices strangers in dark cars. You act ordinary and you hope they don't knock. They don't understand. They left 20 minutes later. No one on my block had seen them, which I know because when I went to the mailbox and blended the neighborhood small talk into a question, people shrugged. "Maybe delivery," Mrs. Halpern said. "She's lived across the street longer than I've been alive, and she can tell when you're making something up." When the knock came on my door 2 days after that, I'd told myself not to answer. I told myself I'd be careful, that I'd call Claire or the police if someone suspicious showed up. But when I peeked through the glass, the man on my porch wasn't how I'd imagined suspicious. He was small, clean-faced, and wearing a dark suit that didn't quite fit the town. He held his hands in front of him like he was trying to be respectful of the weather. His jacket was buttoned, no hat. His shoes looked like they hadn't walked on gravel in months. "Mr. Morales?" he asked. His voice was level. He had an accent I couldn't place. "That's me," I said. He smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. "May I come in?" I said no because my better sense told me to, and then I told him to step onto the porch where the dog could see him. The dog gave the man one look and relaxed. Animals are poor judges of uniforms sometimes. He didn't introduce himself. He removed a thin business card from his inner pocket, held it out, and then drew it back as if remembering he didn't have to show me anything. "I won't take up much time," he said. "I represent parties that monitor certain aerial phenomena." If you'd put 100 possibilities in front of me, even the paranoid ones, I wouldn't have expected that sentence to be the one that felt normal. "Like the FAA?" I asked. It sounded small, like an attempt at comfort. "We work independently of agencies," he said. "We simply advise." He said the word advise like he was giving me an official weather report. Then he tilted his head just enough to make me notice his eyes, which were the exact color of old pennies. "Certain things are better left uncharted, Mr. Morales," he said. "You saw something. That's all anyone had to do. Make a note and move on." He didn't ask for my footage. He didn't demand the card. He didn't even ask me to delete files. He said the sentence, waited a beat, and then added, "For your own good." I told him I didn't understand what he meant. I asked him who he worked for. He smiled without pity. "You've done well to bring this to attention," he said. "Leave it at that." It would have been easier if he'd been vague in a different way. If he'd spoken of national security or scientific hazards or anything I could complain about on a forum and get 100 angry replies. Instead, he sounded like a man who expected to be believed because belief was the currency he dealt in. He stayed long enough to be polite and short enough to be alarming. I asked again if they wanted the footage. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and said the same thing. Certain things are better left uncharted. Then he walked off the porch and down my walk, moving with the same tidy precision as when I'd first noticed the light, like a shadow sliding along a straight edge. After he left, I called Claire and told her. Her voice went small on the line. "You're sure he didn't ask for the data?" she said. "He didn't touch anything," I said. "He just said, leave it." She probably said later. "Weird," she said. "Ben, log everything. Keep copies off-site. Don't go looking for this again if you can help it." The dog went back to sleep. The rest of my afternoon felt like a day after something happened, but you're not sure what. I filed my original footage in 2 places anyway, as if duplication could outrun whatever had just knocked at my door. I found myself watching the sky the next few nights in a way I hadn't before, less for the object and more to see if anyone else had eyes on it. At the observatory meeting that Friday, half the club wanted to talk about the Leonids and the new Mount Claire, swore by, and the other half wanted to ask why my name was on the group chat with a cryptic line about a white frame. People who like to map in the dark like to ask questions. People I trusted offered practical advice and then changed the subject. I don't believe in grand conspiracies. I don't collect stories to prove something. I kept the recordings, the receipts, and the note of the visit in a locked box, and I made a backup on a drive Claire keeps at her place. She promised to store it in an off-site locker. I went to work the next week and shelved books, made coffee for patrons, and tried to count things that made sense. Sometimes, twice a week now, I walk the dog toward the edge of town where the lights thin out. I look up and watch the pockets of sky. I don't go out with the telescope anymore, not at least the way I used to. Partly that's because the town feels watched, a little, like a library with one book someone keeps rereading and then placing back on the shelf. Partly it's because when you stand in clear air after someone tells you not to look, the urge to look becomes something you can't stop thinking about. The man in the suit never returned. The sedan never parked at the end of my street again. The video still has that white frame if I scrub to it. Claire says that's the sort of data that will keep scientists awake for months. The man on my porch said it was better, prudently, to leave some things uncharted. I don't know whether he was right. I don't know why he chose to warn me instead of asking for what I had. I don't know who he represented. I do know one simple thing. The sky behaved in a way I didn't understand, and for the first time in a long while, I felt smaller than the questions I was asking. I was on the roof because it was the only place on the whole property that didn't smell like diesel and cold plastic. We load big orders at night, washing machines, fridges, and when the last pallet was strapped down, I told Tommy I was taking my break up top. He laughed and called me Rooftop Marcus, like he'd done it every night since he'd started. I let him laugh. The roof had a cheap folding chair, a loose cable you could hook your foot under so the wind didn't take your break away, and a view that made the whole facility look small. The string of sodium street lights on Route 7, the neon at the 24-hour diner 2 blocks over, the dark mouth of the interstate where headlights made a river. It was late October, the air had that thin, clean edge from the cold, and there was a low cloud cover, so the sky was a flat, matte gray. I hadn't taken a cigarette in months, but that night I wanted something to do with my hands. I was 2 hours into a 12-hour shift, the usual quiet hum of the place under me, when I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a chopper landing down by the freight yard. You see a lot of weird things at night over the industrial park, and a red beacon is the kind of thing you'd expect. This thing didn't have blinking lights. It was a single, steady blue-white point that hung about 30, maybe 40 feet above the loading dock. It wasn't high, not at all. If you stood on your tiptoes, you could have almost poked it with the broom handle we used to clear the gutters. It hovered there, absolutely still, and the weird part was how bright it was without casting any real shadow. On the roof, it looked like someone had placed a tiny moon and taped it to the air. I whipped out my phone and started filming because that's what people do now. You capture it while you can. The video saved a few seconds, fine. Then the light moved. It didn't descend. It didn't sail off slowly. It darted, 3 quick little jerks like somebody tapping a marble along string, and then it was gone, past the tree line on the other side of the yard. No noise, no heat change, just gone. I sat there for a stupidly long time after it vanished, like if I sat long enough it would pop back into the place it had been. The roof's ladder rattled when someone came up and did the mandatory, "Hey, you up there?" It shook me out of that fix. It was Gary from receiving, and he had the look of a guy who'd had too much coffee and thought he saw a shooting star. I told him what I'd seen. He nodded, like maybe I'd seen a drone or some light off a billboard. He didn't ask to see the footage. When I got down, the security guard, old Pete, who loved to be in the watch booth even though he worked nights and hated sunlight, was on his radio, muttering about a power blip over at Dock 3. The forklift guys were joking about the facility being haunted, and for a while, everything was that kind of talk. Neat, dismissive, the kind of talk you have at 3 a.m. after the weird. I tried to show the clip to Tommy, and it didn't open. The file thumbnail was there, but when I tapped on it, the app crashed. Later, when I plugged the phone into the dock computer to pull the file off, the drive wouldn't mount. At that point, my question felt small and foolish, but the way the phone failed felt like another thing being taken from the story. The next morning, nothing was on the security footage. I walked up to the big screen in the office where they replayed the cameras and watched with the supervisor while the log jumped through the night. Dock 3 showed a 10-minute outage right when I was up there. The upload from the roof camera, the cheap little one we used to keep an eye on the skylights, had a gap too, a clean stretch where the timestamp went blank and then came back. Pete said he'd noticed the console hiccup at 2:47 a.m. and thought the city had tripped a line. The supervisor said, "Must have been an old relay," and circled back to paperwork. I filed it under gremlins in my head and went to the break room for another coffee. That evening, I was on the floor, sliding a shrink-wrapped fridge into position when the main line's lights flicked. Not a storm flicker, but the kind where all the fluorescents dim and the whole place takes on that hollow movie light feel for half a breath. The radios in the dock stuttered and then were fine. Tommy hissed about losing his playlist, and the barcode scanner gave a 1-second hiss and popped back. The forklifts did their little diagnostic beeps. We all carried on because we had to. But there was a thread of quiet that ran through the room after that, like everyone had seen the same thing and didn't want to say it loud enough for management to hear. I thought about it all night. The darting light, the dead file, the camera gap. On my half hour before midnight, I wanted to go back up. I wanted to see if it was there again, to catch something that didn't disappear when we left. The ladder was up again. The cold hit me like a slap. I stood on the roof and watched my breath curl, and the facility below looked like an island. There was a hum in the air I couldn't place, a low metallic note that made the chair vibrate under the butt when a semi passed on Route 7. I did not see a light that night. I sat and listened. I watched the chain link fence. I had a stupid sense that because I had been trying to capture it, I was wanted to be seen. I was an idiot, I thought, because maybe it was a maintenance drone and maybe the file had actually corrupted because I had a cheap phone. I told myself I was done with the rooftop circus. The same week I told myself I was done before, right up until I wasn't. At 3:10 a.m., the warehouse line rang. We have one telephone in the office that rings into a bank of lines. When it jolts awake, everyone looks. Usually it's the delivery company or someone from procurement calling about a manifest. The supervisor picked up because the boss wasn't on tonight. She had the headset on and was politely killing time with an invoice when she frowned and slid the handset over. "Marcus, it's for you," she said, slapping it toward the metal disc. Metal desk. My hand shook a little when I took it. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was low and cultivated, the kind that sounded like it had been practiced in rooms where people practiced calm. No accent, no crackle, only the soft friction you get when someone chooses words. "Mr. Hale," he said. He used my full name in that way people do when they don't need you to interrupt. "Don't stay on the roof after dark again." It was not a question. It was a sentence. It had an odd sort of care in it, like someone reminding you to wear a coat. No badge, no, "This is so-and-so from such and such." I asked who it was because that's what you do when a man tells you what to do. There was a click, like a cigarette getting turned, and then he answered as if the question had been rhetorical. "We watch the property. It's better for you if you stay off the roof after dark. For your own safety. For everyone's." He didn't sound menacing. He didn't threaten. The sentence was oddly mundane, and yet it landed the way an order lands. The voice had the calm confidence of someone who is used to being obeyed. "Who are you?" I said. "What do you mean? You're not stay on the roof." "The roof," he repeated, with a patience that made the hairs on my arms lift. "Don't stay up there. Leave the roof to the professionals." He paused like he was waiting for me to laugh or to tell him it was a prank. "And don't try to record again," he added, like it was obvious, like it was practical. I stared at the gray metal of the desk, at the coffee ring where somebody had set a mug. My supervisor had cleared her throat on the other side of the office but didn't come over. The phones in our little bank hummed with the normal static of a night shift. "Is this the sheriff?" I asked, because that was the answer I wanted. I wanted him to say sheriff and then give a case number so I could go home and sleep. "No," he said. "Good night, Mr. Hale." Then the line clicked. The desk was quiet. The radio beeped out the forklift's call. The clock on the wall said 3:14 a.m. I put the handset down and looked at the clocks and the wall where the security monitors showed nothing but grainy live feeds. I had a sudden, simple certainty that the man on the phone had been standing in the area between Dock 3 and the roof when I filmed. I had no proof. No one else had proof. When I asked Pete if he'd noticed anything on the cameras during the outage, he shrugged and said his console had flashed, but the log had sorted itself. Tommy was making a joke about roof patrol like he had a point to make later, and I laughed because we laugh at things so we don't have to sit with how strange they are. That night, on the way home, I kept my headlights on through the back roads. I drove slightly slower than usual. I don't think the man expected a fight. He didn't yell or threaten me the way you'd hear on some cop show. He just told me not to be there, and somehow that was enough. Enough to make me tuck the phone into the glove box and not pull the clip back up. I don't know why I obeyed. Maybe it was the way he'd used my name, like someone who knew the shape of me. Maybe it was the missing footage and the camera gap and the power blip had smoothed into one thing and his voice fit onto that scene. I'm back on the floor today. The roof is closed after midnight. The supervisor put a note on the bulletin board, "Roof off limits after hours." She didn't say who called or why. She said it was a policy change to protect employees. Pete's console hasn't shown any other gaps. Tommy keeps his jokes to himself. I still think about the small light, how it didn't throw shadows like a wound of light patched in the air. I keep my phone in my pocket, but I haven't tried to film from the roof since. When I stand in the break room and look up at the skylights, they look like blinking eyes. When I close the warehouse door at the end of the shift and step out into the cold, I look at the roof before I turn on to Route 7. I don't know what we watched that night that prompted someone to call and tell me not to be there, and I'm not brave enough to find out. We were driving back from my sister's place in Lebanon, Missouri. It was late, close to midnight, and the roads out there get real empty once you're outside the little towns. My wife, Erin, was dozing in the passenger seat. I had the radio low, just enough to keep myself from zoning out. Somewhere past Conway, the signal started breaking up. At first it was just static, which I figured was normal out there. But then I noticed there were voices mixed in. Not like a bad signal from another station. These were flat, monotone, almost like someone talking through an old intercom. I could make out single words here and there, but they didn't make sense. Continue. Observe. Vehicle. They sounded slowed down, like the pitch was wrong. I turned the volume up a bit, and Erin stirred. "What's that?" she mumbled. "Radio's acting up," I said, trying to play it off. Then it cut out completely for a second. Dead air. Before coming back with more of those voices, but this time louder and overlapping, almost like two people talking at once. Erin sat up. "That's creepy," she said, looking out the window like she was trying to see if maybe it was coming from somewhere else. I reached to turn it off entirely, but before I could, the headlights hit something up ahead. It was a sedan, dark-colored, parked on the shoulder. No hazard lights, no obvious breakdown. Just sitting there, angled slightly toward the road. Two men stood by the passenger side, both wearing black suits. They weren't waving frantically like someone who needed help. It was slower, deliberate. One raised his arm, palm out, motioning for me to stop. I slowed down, but not much. My first thought was maybe an accident or something official, but there were no cones, no flashing lights, no other cars. Erin whispered, "Don't stop." There was something about the way they were standing, too still, too symmetrical. Both had black hats pulled low, not like ball caps, more like old-fashioned fedoras. As we passed, they both turned their heads in perfect sync to watch us. Not fast, not jerky, just smooth, following us with their eyes. The radio hissed again, and one of the overlapping voices seemed to say, "Do not continue," clear as day, before it broke back into garbled noise. I kept my foot on the gas. Erin twisted in her seat to look back, but the road curved slightly, and they were out of sight almost immediately. I was going to tell her to keep looking just in case, but then I saw headlights in the mirror. They appeared so suddenly it made me flinch. Bright, white, way too close for me not to have noticed before. "Is that them?" Erin asked. Her voice was tight. "I don't know," I said, and pressed the accelerator a little harder. The lights stayed exactly the same distance behind us, not gaining, not dropping back, no matter how I adjusted my speed. The radio was still dead, just that faint static with occasional bursts of those flat voices, like a conversation we weren't supposed to hear. Erin reached to turn it off, but when she hit the knob, it didn't do anything. I tried too. Nothing. The dial wouldn't even move. We passed a sign for Marshfield, still 10 miles out. I decided to wait until we got into more populated areas before doing anything drastic. But then the headlights behind us swerved slightly, like whoever it was trying to line up directly in our lane. No passing, just shadowing us perfectly. A couple miles later, Erin said, "They're gone." I checked the mirror. Empty road. I looked out the back window just to be sure. Nothing. No taillights. No reflection. It was like they'd never been there. The radio went completely silent then, like someone had cut the power, and when it came back, it was just my original station playing some country song. We didn't say much after that. By the time we hit Marshfield, there were a few other cars on the road, and I felt a little less like we were being singled out. We pulled into a gas station just to take a breather, but when I shut the car off, the radio made one last burst of static, and under it, I swear I heard that same slow, monotone voice say, "Proceed." Erin heard it too. She just nodded once, real slow. The rest of the drive home was normal, but that stretch of road between Conway and Marshfield, we don't take it anymore. I was on the third night out, sitting low on an old folding stool with my camera on a tripod and the Milky Way running like a pale river over the valley. The heat from the day had bled off, but the ground still smelled faintly of sun and dust. I was doing long exposures, 30 seconds, a minute, stacking frames, trying to catch the underside of the galaxy where it arcs down into the desert. I'd driven 3 hours of two-lane road to get away from towns. The only lights were the red blink of a distant tower and the glow along the highway to the east. I noticed the distortion before I noticed anything that could be a craft. It was like the air itself had a ripple in it, a wavering that made the stars smear sideways for a fraction of a second. I had seen heat shimmer like that off a hood on summer afternoons, but this was midnight. I switched to live view and zoomed to the horizon. The pixels pulsed, and the ground there looked like the oil-slick shimmer you get over asphalt. Then an edge appeared, an angular dark against the warped sky, too clean to be a cloud. It hovered low, half hidden by distortion, a shape that didn't cast light and didn't move like a bird or plane. I set the camera to a 3-minute exposure and sat very still. The desert has a way of telling you how small you are. You measure your breath to the click of the shutter. The first exposure was a slab of black in the lower third, a smear where the distortion had been. I scrolled through the raw file, and there it was again, in the frame before it disappeared entirely. An outline with hard corners, like the back of a triangle, wrapped in that rippling air. I made a half joke to myself about finally finding something worth printing. My phone had no signal out there. That was the point. So I couldn't stream or post. I backed up a couple of frames to the small SSD I carry and sat with a thermos while the sky wheeled above. There was an odd quiet, like the desert had held its breath. The Jeep's dome light 2 ridges down clicked on and off when the guy I'd seen earlier walked back to his truck, and for a minute the whole place felt normal in the way of dark places where nothing dramatic ever happens. I told myself to be careful about what I said out loud. Someone's idea of careful is different when you're alone in a wide place. I looped my camera strap through my belt and checked the battery for the 100th time. The second exposure in my stack showed the thing gone, but the first file, the one with the partial outline, sat on the drive and looked ridiculous in daylight, a smear with geometry like a child's drawing of a kite. I zoomed in, adjusted the raw sliders to see if it was a trick of lens flare. The edges kept showing up different depending on exposure. Sometimes smooth, sometimes faceted, always wrapped in that same jitter. I didn't sleep much. Around 3 in the morning, while I was repacking a lens, a truck rattled up behind my camp, and a pair of headlights stopped on the shoulder, killing their beams. I froze because cars don't usually come out there in the middle of the night. The engine idled for a while and then stopped. Somebody exited the cab. I could hear steps on gravel and the soft clink of metal. A voice called, low and conversational, "Photographer?" I stayed where I was, trying not to make a show of it. The steps came closer, slow and measured, and 2 men stepped into the little ring of light from my camp lantern. They were in unremarkable dark suits that didn't seem to belong to desert nights. Too clean, too fitted, sleeves just long enough to suggest they didn't want to be noticed for their clothing. They had no badges, no flash of official ID that a cop would show. One was a hair under 6 feet, with a face that folded like a map into shadow. The other was smaller, fatter around the middle, and carried himself like someone who had practiced being calm for a living. "Mr. Rivera," the thinner one said without preface, "we're with a government office." I hadn't told anyone my name. I hadn't seen anyone on the dirt road all day. My throat dried out in a low, animal way. "What office?" He smiled with his mouth only, not his eyes, and then, after a beat, said, "National Security Review." The 3 words were said like an explanation and an order at once. He didn't reach for a wallet or card. He kept his hands loosely at his side. I felt a little ridiculous even then. All the conspiracy shows and forum threads I'd read about men in black. And yet, the tone of his voice was something you'd only know in rooms where people didn't need to raise it. "You want to see my pictures?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. The shorter man unfolded a slim tablet from a leather case as if he'd expected I'd say no. "We'd like to review your work," he said. "For everyone's safety, Mr. Rivera, if you could let us see the files, it would help us determine whether there's a hazard or, if necessary, bring in appropriate resources." He said hazard in the dry way of somebody who'd given that word a lot of use. He closed the tablet and waited like it was obvious, like I'd hand over the SSD and it would be simple. Technicians at the other end, a quiet deal, a file transferred and sorted. My instinct said no, but my chest was a slow drumbeat. I'm not a confrontational person, and the desert felt suddenly too small. "Do you have ID?" I asked. "What agency?" "We're federal," the thin one said. "Special review team. We don't want to create alarm out here. There's nothing for the public to worry about. We're only asking to look at your images. If you prefer, we can take a copy with your permission." He held the leather case flat like a plate. Permission. That word settled like a stone. There was a part of me that wanted to pack up and drive the whole way back to the highway and not stop until the first diner. There was also a part that liked the sound of the claim, nothing for the public to worry about, and wondered if that was relief masked as a demand. "Any credentials at all?" I said. "A card?" A number I can call? The thin man opened his mouth and then closed it. For a sliver of time, I thought he'd pull a badge. He didn't. We can go through proper channels, he said, but we have limited time. If you let us review now, it speeds things up. I remember 100 of the small, stupid things I could have done. Insist on 2 forms of ID, ask to see their IDs in the light from the lantern. Call the non-emergency line and ask if a team had been dispatched to the area. Refuse and lock the SSD in my glove box. I did none of that. In the end, I offered to show them one frame on the tiny screen of my camera. They leaned in together, quiet as men in pews looking at a painting. The file showed the smear again, the dark faceted edge wrapped in the shimmer. The thin man's eyebrows went almost imperceptibly up. He said. Interesting. He didn't say, that's it, or that's nothing. He said, interesting, like a watchmaker saying something about a movement. Are you going to take my card? I asked finally. No, the smaller man said. Not right now. He pulled a thin slip of paper from his jacket and flattened it in my palm. Call this number tomorrow morning. We'll coordinate a review if there's further concern. His handwriting was neat and anonymous. A central office line, no name, no extension. They retreated to the truck and sat under the curve of its dark hood for a minute, then drove slowly down the road and were gone. The dust settled like someone had put a lid on the place. I didn't sleep. I packed up at first light, the thermos left half full, the SSD wrapped in a plastic bag in my camera bag. I couldn't shake the idea that I'd see them again at the next bend. I waited until midday to call the number on the slip. It was a disconnected line. When I went through the files that week at home on my big monitor in daylight, a few of the frames were gone, not corrupted, simply absent. The raw folder had blanks where a file should have been. The images I'd shown them still sat on the drive, the one with the outline, but neighboring frames had vanished. I ran checks, did everything I could to be methodical. The copies I'd made on the SSD earlier that night were intact at first, and then a day later, one of the copies wouldn't mount without an error. Files get fussy, drives fail, and maybe it was nothing but bad luck. Maybe it was something else. I kept the rest of the images both printed and on multiple backups because that's what you do when you don't quite trust that a file will be there tomorrow. I thought about posting a carefully cropped still or emailing it to a friend at the university who knew optics. I didn't. I closed the folder and walked away. People I told later at the coffee shop, in the camera store, were interested in parts and dismissive in others. None of them told me I'd made a mistake showing the frame. None of them could explain the blank files. The thin man's look when he said interesting replayed itself in my head like a half-remembered headline. A week later, there was a local story about a maintenance crew reporting odd lights by a cell tower a county over. The accounts were thin, a flash, a shimmer, nothing firm. I sent an anonymous link to my friend at the university and asked what he thought about refracted air and sensor artifacts. He wrote back that some of the edges in my RAW looked inconsistent with flare. He promised to look more closely. He didn't. He didn't have time. And then his thesis defense took over his life, and then life did what life does. The slip of paper is sitting in my wallet between the business card from the motel and a receipt from the diner. The number still doesn't work. I went back to the desert a month later and set up in roughly the same place, because that's the only honest way I know to answer the question in my own head. The nights were clear, the Milky Way hung like before, and I watched the horizon and waited. Nothing else came into the frames the way that thing had. I made photos anyway, long exposures and short, because I had to do something with my hands. I kept a copy of the original frame for myself, and another in a fireproof box at the bank, and another with my friend at the gallery who asked quietly if I'd ever received anyone who wanted the images for national security. He didn't press. I didn't press him. I didn't hand over the raw files that night, and I haven't heard from the men again. I don't know whether that makes me lucky or foolish. The image sits on my drive, and some of the frames around it are gone, and when I look at the smear of pixels and lean into the light and adjust contrast, there's an edge like a small folded wing. I was coming back from my sister's place along County Route 9 when I saw it. A shape, dark against the thinning blue of the tree line to my right, moving slowly like a piece of ragged cloud someone was dragging across the tops of the maples. It didn't have lights. It didn't make a sound. For a second, I thought it was a tarp caught in a branch. Then it slipped higher, and for a heartbeat, I could swear it had an edge, a pale underside like fabric caught in a lamplight. My name's Jenna. I live just outside of Millersfield, and I drive that stretch of road on weeknights when I've stayed too long and want to get home without stopping. I slowed because you slow when something's off on a two-lane, every pothole on. The truck behind me that had been tailing at a distance nudged closer, then backed off. All the other cars seemed either nowhere or a long way away. My headlights brightened the shoulder in neat rectangles, and the thing above the trees kept drifting, like it was reading the road with me. I pulled off by the old berry farm to take a better look. There's a lay-by there with a bent sign and an old stone wall. The radio in the car was tuned to dead static, which I didn't notice until the engine ticked, and the only sound for a time was my own breath. The shape moved toward the east, away from me, sliding along the outer edge of the woods. A flock of starlings lifted from a telephone wire and then settled like nothing had happened. No frenzied scattering, no alarm calls. That struck me more than the thing itself. I took out my phone because that's what everyone thinks to do now. The camera app opened, but where the viewfinder should have been was a flat gray for a second. Then the autofocus hunted and nothing steady came up. The timestamp showed the right time. The photo folder had yesterday's pictures and now a new blank thumbnail. I laughed at myself. Short, the sort of laugh you try when something is eerily familiar, and the laugh sounded too loud in the quiet. When I got back into the car, there was a sedan idling farther down the lane than the berry farm. Lights off, its grille catching the last of the dusk like a pair of eyes. It was the kind of black you notice when you live somewhere where cars are usually older and beige. Not the normal black, but that smooth, factory, deep black. The windows were darker than legal tint in my state. You could not see a face. When I eased back onto the road, the sedan followed at a discreet distance, maybe 2 car lengths, and kept that distance like a person who doesn't want to make a scene. I checked my mirrors 3 times in as many minutes, and each time found the car there, a little black rectangle in a rectangle. For a while, I tried to write it off as coincidence. The driver had turned the same way I had. Maybe they were going to the same exit. Maybe they were late-night delivery or a bored neighbor. But then my phone lost signal. Bars fell from 3 to none in about 10 seconds, and the GPS went from the polite blue line to a tiny spinning wheel. I don't know why that mattered so much. It did. The road was familiar, but my head started making room for what-ifs. I took the slow route through town, the one with the diner and the one blinking red light, figuring the driver would peel off to one of the side streets or the gas station. Instead, he stayed behind me, patient, like a shadow that had learned to keep pace. When I stopped at the single light on Main and waited, a car that would have been there both nights before spun their wheels in the intersection and went past. The black sedan slowed a little but did not pull forward. The seated figure was not visible until the light turned green, and I straightened the wheel and went. When I glanced into the rear view, the mass of dark was exactly where it had been. No blink, no signal. I tried turning off to see if the car would pass. I cut down Maple Avenue. The sedan stayed. I turned the radio up and tuned to the classical station I sometimes play to keep the late-night highway from feeling too empty. The string quartet came through for a few bars, then the music dropped out, one channel silent, while another floated in the passenger's window, like a ghost. It felt like being in a room where one person had stopped breathing. At the edge of Millersfield, there's a strip of newer houses and a wisp of streetlight that felt like civilization to me. I made the turn toward the high school, toward the lit circle of parking lot lamps and the marbled reflection of its sign, and the sedan stayed back, notched a length, and then kept it. For a moment, I considered throttling down to stop on the shoulder and see what would happen, but then I thought of saying to strangers later, I stopped, and how smart that would sound, and how some small practical muscle in me wanted to be home and in bed rather than right there, waiting to be noticed. At the Walgreens on Oak, I parked under a floodlight and got out. I walked up to the automatic doors with my phone in my fist, and the air felt thicker, the night pressing down like a lid. The sedan pulled into the lot and idled behind a delivery truck as if it had no business parking under the light. When I came back out, my hands with the paper bag from the pharmacist, the car was still there. Two men emerged in dark coats, no hats, walked around the sedan in the kind of practiced silence you hear in movies, and carried no lumps, no backpacks. They moved with that odd, synchronized step that makes you think of trained runners. One of them looked straight at me as I crossed the lot. He was maybe in his 40s, short hair, clean-shaven, and his suit was the sort of expensive that doesn't crease. The other's face was turned away when I first saw him, and even then his jawline had a hardness to it. The man who looked at me held my eye for less than a second, then offered something that matched the quiet of their approach, a small polite nod. No smile, but not unfriendly. There was nothing theatrical about them. Nobody said the word sir, nobody called my name, but I felt as if I'd been asked something without a question having been asked. "Everything okay?" The nearer man said, and his voice was something I could have heard in a grocery store, the tone of someone who was checking in. "I'm fine," I said, because that was true. "Just heading home." He inclined his head like someone reading a map no one else sees. "Keep to the main roads tonight," he said. "Avoid the ridge if you can." He sounded like an officer giving a routine instruction, but there was no uniform to back it up. The words were neutral and absolutely specific at once. Keep to the main roads, don't go the ridge. I was the sort of person who rarely drove the ridge at night, and yet I'd been planning to take it. It's shorter, it's pretty, it curls along the hollow where you can see the entire valley if the sky's clear. I told myself his advice was helpful and thoughtless and meant to help. We stood in the glow of the Walgreens sign like two people who had happened to cross each other in the middle of an errand. The man's eyes were an ordinary color, the color of old coins. And after that split second, I realized I didn't know his name, and I didn't need to. The sedan's windows were closed. The air conditioning hummed. A trash truck somewhere down Oak pulled its compactor, and the sound filled the small distance between us like a reminder that life moved on. I said thanks and walked to my car with my bag. I drove off the lot and made the slow right toward the highway rather than the left that would have taken me up the ridge. The black car eased out of the lot right behind me and followed, but by the time I got onto Route 22, the sedan kept its distance and then, just before the bridge, turned down a side street with such quiet resolution that a part of me realized it had never been following me to press me, just to watch the choice I made. It bothered me that I felt relief when its taillights faded. At home, the house felt too bright when I turned the porch light on. Eli, my neighbor's kid, was on his porch with a bike and a dog and a face full of late-night cereal breath. I told him hello and kept my hand on the screen of the door like a talisman. Inside, I locked the deadbolt and sat on the couch with the television on for the way the light filled the room and made the world look ordinary. I told my sister about it later on the phone in sparse pieces. Shape over the trees, phone glitched, black car followed, and she said I should call the police, or at least the sheriff, but I didn't. They would ask for a location, for a license plate, for proof. I had nothing except for the image of a shape that looked like a smudge and a polite man who told me to stick to the main roads. Days passed. The newscasters mentioned nothing. The farmer who runs the berry field down the lane came by with a crate of strawberries and laughed when I told him about the shape and the men in black. And his laugh made a face like he was both humoring me and telling me to watch my head. My phone worked again like nothing had happened. The photo folder had the blank thumbnail I hadn't deleted. Sometimes I open it and stare at the gray, trying to remember the edge of the thing in the trees. There was a small, steady feeling under my skin like a held breath. I kept to the main roads for a week because the man's voice had been calm and practical, and because part of me wanted to obey someone who had been polite about it. It seemed such a small concession. Still, sometimes at night I would pull onto the ridge anyway and park at the overlook, more out of habit than bravery, to see the valley lights and to remind myself that the sky could be ordinary. Once I went up and there was no shape at all, only the hush of crickets and the distant blink of the highway. Another time there was a thin smear, like the one I'd seen before, but it vanished before I could be sure, and my phone stuttered when I tried to record it. Whatever the men were watching, if they were watching at all, didn't drag anyone away or break a public law. They left nothing but a memory and a suggestion and a shadow that matched my pace until I made a different decision. I did not go back to the ridge that night, and the car did not follow when I turned toward the lit streets. Sometimes I wonder if they were trying to warn me or to guide me, and I do not know which would be worse. For now, what I have is a blank thumbnail in my phone and a polite note of instruction given by two men in sharp coats. I lock my doors a little earlier than I used to and keep the porch light on until dawn. I take the long way home on odd nights, and when the sky is clear, I look up and tell myself to be ordinary. The rest of it, what I saw, who they were, stays in that gray place on the screen where a picture should be. The lights rose out of the water like somebody was lifting a string of fishing buoys straight up and into the sky. I had been out on the skiff because the tide had turned the way it does in late September. The river that feeds the harbor goes full mouth on you, and if you like to catch fluke or stripers, you go where the current puts them. I'm Eddie Morales. I fish nights when the town is quiet and the restaurants aren't buying, and that night the air was the kind that smelled of salt and wet rope. Humid but not warm, with a low fog rolling in from the headlands. My ladder lights were on. I had a small thermos of coffee tucked under the bow, and my radio was a soft hiss in the console. I saw the first light maybe a half-mile out. At first I thought somebody'd left a headlamp on a dinghy. Then another popped up, then another, like soft lures bouncing on the surface. But they didn't bob. They came straight up, slow and steady, and then they were at least 20, maybe 30 feet in the air, hovering as if they'd found a place to rest in the fog. They didn't make sound. They weren't the usual kind of navigation light, either. Pale blue, steady, not blinking. One broke away and drifted inland, cutting a diagonal beam like someone dragging a pencil through the mist. The rest stacked above the sea like a constellation coming undone. I swallowed my coffee and the thermos cracked the air on the way down. My hands were still steady enough to keep the skiff from swinging, but my chest had a tightness in it you don't get unless you've seen something that can't be out where it is. The fish finder went quiet. Not zero quiet, just a thin, flat beep where usually you get bars and dashes from bait, from schools, a chorus of sonar. I fiddled with the gain. The screen blinked and then showed nothing but my boat's shadow. My radio went from the usual clam to a kind of thin metallic static that made the speaker sound like it was behind glass. For a little while I just watched. A school of cormorants slid off the water like a black hand being pulled away. They circled and then left, and the lights stayed. Then, as if someone had let go of a net, the lights lifted. Straight up and into the fog, pale dots dissolving until there was nothing but normal night and the low roar of the tide hitting the breakwater. I fumbled for my phone and tried to take video. It recorded the first handful of frames, the lights rising, the fog thickening. But then the phone went from 12% battery to dead in about the time it takes you to say, "What the hell?" I laughed at that, because that's the kind of joke you make to keep your head when a device betrays you. I started the engine and cut a slow circle through the spot where the lights had been, just to stir the water and see if anything came up. My line stayed slack, which is the wrong kind of indicator. By the time I eased back toward the dock, the fog had thickened like soup. A pair of headlights came up the boat ramp slow and then pulled off into the lot. There were two men standing by the pilings, dark against the sodium lights. They were in suits so black they ate the light, and they had the look of people who had been outdoors and decided at the last minute that suits were the right thing to wear. One of them had a raincoat draped over his arm, though it wasn't raining. The other had shoes I couldn't tell were wet or not. They had that clean shine you get from rubber that's never been dragged through mud. They weren't laughing, weren't talking, just watching my boat as I gunned the motor in and trimmed the lines. Good night, I said, because you say that to people at docks even when your voice wants more. They stepped up like they were already beside me. No sideways thing, just two measured paces. The taller one smiled the kind of smile that's been practiced a lot and never used for warmth. You out late, he said, and then both of them looked back at the water as if we were all sharing the same screen. I do the night runs, I said. Tide's right for it. I cinched the cleat. My hands felt slow. The fog had a way of dragging the sound toward the harbor, which makes conversations feel private even if they're in public. We saw lights, the shorter man said. He had the pause of someone who wanted his syllables weighed. Marine life? The man used the term like it should.